Tonight, welcome, my friend, wherever you are listening from, across a quiet living room, a dim bedroom, a long road, or a small corner of the world where the night has just begun. I'm grateful you are here. Take a slow breath, settle your shoulders, and allow the noise of your day to drift a little further away. You've arrived in a calm space, a place made for gentle stories, soft ideas, and the kind of history that lets your mind rest while your imagination wanders. In this video, we will step into the world of Atlantis, not the loud, glittering version you may have seen in movies, but the quiet, ancient island whispered about for thousands of years. We will walk through its origins, its triumphs, its mysteries, and the lessons it still leaves for us today. You will hear of its landscapes, its people, its forgotten knowledge, and the long echo it casts across the world. This will not be a story of explosions or battles shouted in haste. It will unfold slowly, like waves rolling along an empty shore at dusk. As you listen, let each part come to you like a soft lantern glow, the birth of the island, the hopes that shaped its people, the conflicts and choices that led it toward greatness, and the quiet forces, inside and outside, that guided its rise and fall. You will hear about the myths, the misunderstandings, the scholarly debates, and the way Atlantis continues to live in films, books, and our imaginations. And at the end of this journey, you may find that the legend is less about a sunken city and more about us, our balance, our ambitions, our fragile hopes. Before we drift deeper into tonight's story, I want to gently ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it on your side of the world? Our audience comes from many countries, many time zones, many lives, but somehow, for these quiet moments, we meet here in the same place. Tell me in the comments if you feel comfortable. I always enjoy seeing where these stories travel. If you find comfort in these calm late-night journeys, if the history, the atmosphere, or simply the sound of the storytelling helps you relax, consider tapping the like button. It helps more people who love this kind of slow, soothing content discover it. And if you haven't already, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so you never miss the next night's chapter. This channel is here for you, for the restless nights, the thoughtful evenings, the quiet moments when you want to close your eyes and drift into a world far from your own. Tonight, Atlantis waits for us like a memory in deep water, so let your room dim a little, let your breath slow, let the world soften around the edges, and when you're ready, we'll begin our journey into the lost island beneath the waves. Tonight's gentle journey begins with part 1, where we drift softly into the origins, the quiet ancient beginnings of Atlantis. The night settles around the listener like a warm tide, and in that quiet, the story opens far before the rise of kingdoms, before ships carved their paths across the seas, before maps learned to name the world. Atlantis, as the old philosophers whispered, began not as a place of marble towers, but as a memory carried by waves. It is said that long before any historian put ink to parchment, the ocean itself held stories, slow, deep, patient stories, about a land that once rose bright beneath the sun. In these early whispers, Atlantis was not yet the sprawling empire that later generations imagined. It was simply an island blessed with fertile soil, calm harbours, and people who listened carefully to the rhythm of the sea. The origins of their world were tied to the forces around them, warm winds that shaped their seasons, quiet dawns that illuminated their valleys, and the shifting blue horizon that promised both abundance and danger. In those distant centuries, the Atlanteans cherished a desire deeply woven into their culture, the longing to understand their world. They gazed at tides and moonlight with the same curiosity that others saved for stars. They believed that knowledge itself was a gift, a responsibility carried with reverence. Yet even in such peace, they carried quiet struggles, moments of uncertainty when storms arrived too early, when the earth trembled beneath their homes, when they wondered whether the gods who shaped their island favoured or tested them. These doubts lived gently in the background, never loud, but present enough to remind them that all beginnings were fragile. External forces soon pushed against their early harmony. Traders from distant coasts arrived with unfamiliar accents and different customs, sometimes with open hands, sometimes with envy in their eyes as they looked upon the island's quiet prosperity. The sea brought opportunity, but it also brought watchers, outsiders who marvelled at the island's natural wealth, its brilliant metals, its far-reaching waterways. Even nature itself became a silent challenger. The ocean would rise and fall unpredictably, and the winds of late summer grew stronger year after year, shaping the Atlanteans' sense that their homeland was both blessed and precarious. But the people of Atlantis were not alone in their beginnings. Their elders carried stories of a time when wise teachers, some said priests, some said scholars, guided the island's earliest generations. These mentors taught the first Atlanteans how to read currents, how to build homes that aligned with sunlight, how to chart simple star paths to guide their small, proud fleets. Under their soft guidance, the island's first settlements learned resilience, patience, and balance. And with this foundation, Atlantis grew. Not suddenly, not with grand declarations, but slowly, like a coastline forming over centuries. The turning point in its early development came quietly, the discovery of rich mineral veins deep beneath the hills. It allowed the islanders to build tools stronger, ships sturdier, and trade goods finer than anything their neighbours had seen. Some historians still debate whether this discovery marked the true birth of Atlantis as a rising power, or whether it marked the beginning of its temptations. Yet in these first centuries, the results felt simple: progress, cooperation, and a sense that their island was chosen for something greater. The origins of Atlantis, softly illuminated by early morning sun and the hush of ocean winds, formed the gentle seed of everything that would follow: its triumphs, its wonders, and eventually its tragedies. But for now, in this opening chapter of its long, drifting memory, Atlantis remains a young land, full of potential, surrounded by shimmering horizons, watched over by calm seas that seem to breathe with the island itself. And as the night deepens, one might imagine that island still rising out of the mist, its first fires glowing faintly along the shore, a quiet beginning waiting to unfold. Tonight you are listening to part 2 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift slowly through how Atlantis came to be, how land, sea and people were woven together into one quiet legend. Long before anyone spoke the name Atlantis, there was only water and sky, and a restless line where the two met. Some storytellers imagine the seabed shifting in the deep, invisible darkness, plates of rock pressing and sliding until one ridge rose higher than the rest. Bit by bit, in the slow language of geology, that ridge became an island. At first, it was only a shadow beneath the surface, then a broken line of rocks, then, after ages of pressure and fire and cooling, dry land, glistening with newborn soil. The first mornings on that young island would have been simple and silent. Mist curling above black stones, seabirds circling, waves testing the edges of the shore. Nature, in those beginnings, moved with patience. Streams carved their paths from the hills, carrying minerals down to the flatlands, seeds swept by wind and water from distant coasts, found a home in the fresh earth. Over time, green spread across the island like a calm, slow breath. By the time the first people arrived, whether by accident, storm-tossed, or with intention, guided by stars and courage, the island was ready to receive them. These first Atlanteans stepped onto the sand with a mixture of fear and hope. They saw fertile plains, sheltered bays, and mountains that seemed to watch over everything like ancient guardians. Deep inside, they carried a quiet desire to build a home that would last, a place where their children could grow up safe, where hunger would be rare and war a distant echo. That wish became the soft heartbeat of early Atlantis. Yet, even in this hopeful beginning, they struggled with doubts and inner questions. Could they trust this new land? Would the sea that brought them here one day take everything back? Some feared the storms that sometimes gathered suddenly on the horizon, stacked clouds that darkened the waves. Others worried about whether their small community had the strength to survive without the familiar support of their old homelands. Around evening fires, voices would drop low as they confessed their fears of the unknown, of their own mistakes, of quarrels that could tear a fragile community apart. These were not loud conflicts, but small human hesitations that quietly shaped how Atlantis was born. Outside forces began to press on them too. The sea, beautiful and generous, could be harsh and unforgiving. Storm seasons carved away sections of shoreline. Sudden squalls overturned fishing boats. Distant raiders, noticing smoke rising from this new island, sometimes steered closer to see if there was something worth taking. The first generations of Atlanteans learned fast that to live on such a place meant living in constant conversation with the forces around them, wind, wave, and the wary eyes of strangers. But Atlantis did not grow alone. The people leaned on certain guides, elders, seers, and those who watched the natural world with careful attention. Some legends say the god of the sea himself, often named as Poseidon in later Greek retellings, favoured this island and raised protective rings of land and water around its first city, circles of harbours, canals, and channels that both defended and nourished it, whether one believes the literal story or not. The idea behind it is gentle and powerful. Atlantis came to be through a combination of human effort and something greater than them, a kind of guiding wisdom that helped them understand tides, seasons, and the right places to build. These mentors, divine in myth, human in quieter versions, taught the Atlanteans to shape stone, to irrigate fields, to split their land into harmonious zones of farming, living, and worship. Slowly, a clear pattern emerged on the island's surface, concentric rings of water and earth, ordered fields, ports where ships could safely rest. The story reaches a soft turning point when the Atlanteans stop simply surviving and start shaping their world with intention. They discovered rich metals in the hills and learned how to refine them. They built temples and meeting halls at the centre of their main city, places where decisions were made not in haste, but in long, thoughtful councils. Children grew up knowing that their island was special, not only because it was fertile, but because their parents told them in the quiet of night that this land had been lifted, chosen, or blessed. That belief gave them confidence and, in time, a sense of destiny. Still, every step forward carried its own pressure. As their population grew, they needed more food, more space, more resources. Leaders argued softly among themselves about whether to expand outward across the sea or deepen their roots further into the island's interior. Some wanted to stay small and self-contained, fearing that too much growth would anger the gods or unbalance the harmony they had carefully built. Others felt a rising ambition, the wish to see Atlantean ships travel beyond the horizon, bringing back new materials, new knowledge, and perhaps tribute from other lands. This gentle tension between contentment and expansion sat right at the centre of how Atlantis came to be, not just as a place on a map, but as an idea, a power that might one day look beyond its shores. In the end, the island itself became their quiet teacher. The pattern of seasons, the way the soil responded to careful tending, the balance between land and water in their canal systems, all of these lessons nudged them toward a way of life that respected structure, planning, and balance. Atlantis was born as a harmony between many forces, the deep, hot heart of the earth that raised it, the cool, patient sea that shaped it, the cautious hands of its first settlers, the wise eyes of its teachers, and the restless dreams of those who looked at the skyline and wondered how far their influence could reach. When we say how Atlantis came to be, we are not only describing an island lifting from the ocean floor or a group of sailors finding a new home. We're also describing the slow forming of an identity, a people who believed they stood at the centre of something important, a meeting point between earth, water, and the will of unseen powers. As night wraps around this part of the story, you can picture that young island once more, its rivers newly carved, its first stone walls just rising, its harbour fires flickering at the edge of the dark sea. And above it all, a sky of quiet stars, watching as a legend quietly takes shape. Tonight you are listening to part 3 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will follow a gentle timeline, drifting slowly from the first humble days of the island to the distant echo of its disappearance. If you close your eyes, you might imagine time itself as a quiet tide, flowing in and out around Atlantis, carrying moments, lives, and centuries in its slow, unhurried rhythm. At the beginning of this timeline, the island is still young, as we have seen, a rising of stone and soil from the deep, an untouched place of streams, hills, and sheltered bays. The first era is the age of arrival, when scattered groups of settlers reach the shores in small wooden ships, their sails patched, their hearts full of cautious hope. They build simple homes close to the water, learn which crops will grow in the new soil, and develop a relationship with the sea that is equal parts reverence and fear. In these early generations, their strongest desire is modest. They want only stability, enough food, and peace among themselves. They argue softly over small things, feel anxiety at every strange cloud on the horizon, and wonder if they have been wise to trust this island. But little by little, the land answers their effort with abundance, and the people begin to feel that maybe, just maybe, they belong here. Then, as years turn into centuries, the timeline moves into what might be called the Age of Order. The settlements spread inward from the coast. Paths become roads, and the first true city takes shape in a natural basin near the sea. Canals are dug with patient hands, forming rings of water and earth that make Atlantis both beautiful and defensible. Elders become lawmakers, and loose customs turn into agreed rules, then into laws recited in public gatherings beneath carved stone pillars. The greatest desire of this era is clarity. The Atlanteans want to understand their roles, their duties, their place in the grand pattern of their island. Yet beneath this order lives an inner unease. Some feel that strict rules might crush the freedom of the spirit. Others worry that their leaders, so admired for their wisdom, may slowly drift into pride. The tension is quiet, like a hairline crack in polished marble, small at first, but growing with time. Outside forces begin to notice. Trading ships from far coasts arrive, eyes widening at the sight of Atlantean harbours and their smooth stone quays. Visitors bring new goods, new stories, and also new comparisons. Atlantis learns it is richer in metals, stronger in ships, more advanced in engineering than many neighbouring lands. This awareness marks the shift into the age of expansion. Atlantean fleets push outward along known trade routes and beyond them, mapping currents, founding outposts, building relationships with foreign rulers. The island's desire grows bolder, no longer just survival or order, but influence. They wish to be a guiding power upon the seas. Yet this dream carries internal struggles. Some citizens long for simpler times and fear that foreign luxuries and ambitions will erode their old values. Others, especially younger generations, feel restless if the navy does not sail farther, if the markets do not brim with new wonders. Between these viewpoints, a quiet conflict unfolds in council chambers and around family tables, tradition murmuring against ambition, each claiming to protect the true soul of Atlantis. At this point in our gentle timeline, it might be a good moment for you to settle a little deeper where you are. Perhaps you're listening from a quiet bedroom, or a small apartment in a busy city, or a distant place by the sea. You might notice what time it is where you are right now. Late at night, maybe, or the small hours before dawn. If this slow journey through history helps you relax, you are always welcome to stay with these stories and, whenever you feel ready, to follow and subscribe to the entire history so that each new chapter can find you again when night returns. And now we drift back to Atlantis. As the age of expansion continues, the island's power reaches its high point. This is the Age of Radiance, the Golden Age, at the centre of many legends. The capital glows with polished stone, gleaming metals, statues of heroes and gods. Water flows through carefully engineered channels, fountains, and baths. The temples rise with quiet grandeur, their columns aligned with stars and solstices. Scholars study astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Artists carve intricate patterns into walls and weave stories into tapestries. The Atlanteans' desire now is perfection. They want their city to be unmatched, their laws to be the model for others, their knowledge to approach the wisdom of the gods themselves. Yet this age of light also casts long shadows. Inside some hearts, pride swells. A few begin to believe that Atlantis is destined to rule not just its immediate neighbours, but the world beyond the horizon. Others, especially the keepers of older traditions, feel a tightening in their chests. They sense that the balance between humility and power is slipping. While this inner unease grows, the outer world reacts. Rival powers, more modest in technology, but fierce in spirit, begin to resist his Atlantean influence. Merchant cities form alliances to counter their trade dominance. Small coastal kingdoms strengthen their defences against Atlantean fleets. The timeline now enters an era of gentle but persistent strain, the age of friction. Diplomatic missions become more tense, negotiations more complicated. The sea, once a calm ally, shows its temper with a series of harsher storms and subtle changes in currents that make long voyages riskier. Nature, human ambition, and the responses of neighbouring people start to weave together into a complex, fragile web. Still, Atlantis has its helpers, its guiding voices. Priests, philosophers, and a few wise rulers remind the people of older lessons, that true greatness lies not just in wealth and armies, but in balance, justice, and respect for the forces that gave them their island in the first place. These mentors, whether real historical figures or remembered in myth, stand like lanterns along the timeline, trying to keep the path illuminated. For a while, their council slows the rush toward excess. Some reforms are made, some wars are avoided, some laws are softened to protect the poor and the weak. But every timeline has its turning points, those moments when long tensions quietly tip into change. For Atlantis, myths and later retellings speak of the age of overreach, when the island's leaders finally step beyond the line that balance can support. Perhaps it is a campaign of conquest that goes too far, or a series of treaties that demand too much tribute, or extravagant building projects that strain the land's resources. Internally, the people feel more divided between loyalty and resentment, trust and doubt. Externally, enemies grow bolder, forming coalitions against them. At the same time, the natural world seems to react with unease, more tremors in the earth, restless waves, an uneasy sky. And then, in many versions of the story, comes the last brief segment of the timeline, the age of collapse. In a single night of storms and fire, or over a series of years marked by earthquakes and floods, the carefully built rings of land and water are broken. The city that once shone becomes a dark outline against crashing waves. Ships are lost, harbours destroyed, fields drowned. Whether we imagine it as one catastrophic event or a slow unravelling, the outcome is the same. Atlantis, as a living, breathing civilization, fades from the surface of the world. What continues, however, is the final, quiet part of the timeline, the age of memory. Survivors, if there were any, carry stories to other lands. Sailors speak of a sunken island in the deep Atlantic. Philosophers, like Plato centuries later, shape these tales into dialogues that explore justice, power, and the rise and fall of ideal states. Scholars debate whether Atlantis was ever real or always a symbol. In this way, the timeline of Atlantis does not end with its sinking. It shifts from stone and soil into words, myths, and careful, sleepy retellings like the one you're hearing now. If you trace this whole arc in your mind, from the first wet rocks lifting from the sea, through the ages of arrival, order, expansion, radiance, friction, overreach and collapse, and finally into memory, you can feel how Atlantis moves across time like a wave, rising, cresting, and falling back into the ocean that once let it bloom. And somewhere in that long, gentle curve of ages, there is a hush, a lingering image of an island at dusk, its lights reflected in calm water, just before the page of history slowly turns. Tonight you are listening to part 4 of our Atlantis journey. And in this part, we will drift softly into the unsolved mysteries surrounding Atlantis, the questions that never quite go away, no matter how many centuries pass. When people think of Atlantis, they do not only imagine marble halls and shining harbours, they also feel a gentle itch in the mind, a sense that something important might be hidden just out of reach, somewhere beneath the waves or between the lines of old books. Our story has followed Atlantis from its beginnings to its rise, but now we pause and listen to the questions that echo in the spaces where the facts grow thin. At the heart of these mysteries lies a simple one. Did Atlantis truly exist in the way the legends say, or was it always a careful story shaped for teaching? In the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Plato wrote of a powerful island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a place that rose in great strength and then fell in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars have turned these pages over and over, wondering whether Plato was describing a real memory, perhaps passed down from older civilizations, or whether he created an idealized city as a mirror for his ideas about justice and pride. The desire that lives inside this question is quiet but strong. People want Atlantis to be real. They want to believe that somewhere in humanity's past there was a great island civilization, shining and complex, whose loss explains some of the blank spaces in our early history. Yet the moment we reach for certainty, we meet inner doubts. Even for those who long for Atlantis to be more than myth, there is a small, honest voice asking, if it truly existed as described, why have we not found clear ruins, inscriptions, or records outside of Plato's work? This tension lives inside many readers and listeners, a soft struggle between wonder and skepticism. Some feel guilty for doubting, others feel uneasy for believing too easily. In a way, Atlantis becomes a mirror for our own inner world. How much proof do we need before we allow ourselves to dream, and how much dreaming do we allow before we insist on proof? That quiet internal conflict is one of the deepest mysteries of all. Outside of these personal doubts, the world itself adds its own riddles. Explorers have sailed the Atlantic for centuries, mapping coastlines, measuring depths, sending machines down into the darkness. They have found mid-ocean ridges, underwater mountains, and unusual shapes on the seafloor, but nothing that every expert can agree upon as the lost city. Some believe the story may point not to the open ocean, but to other regions that suffered volcanic disasters or tsunamis in deep antiquity. Geological traces of ancient floods and eruptions hint at real catastrophes that could have inspired the tale. Yet each promising clue meets another contradiction, another missing piece, as if the earth itself were keeping its counsel. Into these gaps step helpers of a different kind. Historians, archaeologists, geologists, and linguists each bring a lantern to the darkness, offering methods that can test the claims slowly and carefully. They examine layers of ash, patterns of trade in pottery, hints of vanished coastlines in sediment and coral. They compare the structure of Plato's narrative to other myths and teaching stories, asking whether its shape feels more like memory or like allegory. Their work does not answer every question, but it keeps the conversation honest, reminding us that even the most enchanting legends must be weighed against the deep, patient record of the earth and of human culture. Not everyone walks so gently. Around the edges of this topic, there are sensational claims of entire cities in blurry photographs and stories that link Atlantis to every unexplained monument and mystery on Earth. These louder versions tug at a different desire inside us, the wish for everything unknown to belong to one grand story. For some, that vision is thrilling. For others, it feels like a storm that makes it harder to see the calmer truths hiding underneath. In the middle of these cross currents, the gentle listener may feel pulled in different directions. On one side, the wish for wonder. On the other, the need for clarity. And in that space, it can help to slow down, to notice for a moment where you are right now. Perhaps you are in a quiet room, the lights low, listening near midnight, or in the early hours of morning. If you'd like, you can take a slow breath in and out, and just notice what time it is where you are, and what city or country you're listening from. If these soft journeys into history and legend bring you peace, you are always welcome to stay close, to return to new stories, and, when it feels right, to subscribe to the entire history so that each new chapter can find you again when the night is quiet. As you settle again into the story, more mysteries rise like faint shapes on the horizon. One of them is the question of Atlantean knowledge. Plato describes a people advanced in engineering, shipbuilding, and governance. Later storytellers added details of deep scientific wisdom. Some even imagined technologies that sound almost modern. Did a real ancient society once stand at the edge of what was possible, mastering irrigation, stonework, and navigation in ways that outshone their neighbours? Or have later centuries projected their own longings backward, painting Atlantis with the colours of every unrealised human dream? The absence of hard evidence leaves space for both humility and awe. Another quiet riddle surrounds the moral shape of the legend. In Plato's account, Atlantis is not simply a victim of fate. It decays from within as its people grow greedy and unjust, turning away from the balance they once kept. Was this detail based on memories of a real society whose power led to excess and downfall, or was it designed as a warning to Plato's own city, a story meant to remind Athens that even great states can fall if they lose their moral centre? Scholars gently debate this point, some leaning toward historical kernel, others toward philosophical parable. Both possibilities carry a soft weight. Either way, Atlantis becomes a reflection of how fragile greatness can be. There is also the mystery of survival. If Atlantis sank, or if a real place once suffered disaster, did anyone escape? Legends in different cultures speak of wise strangers arriving from across the sea, bringing new skills in farming, building, or astronomy. Some modern writers have tried to connect these scattered tales into a single thread, imagining refugees quietly seeding knowledge around the world. The evidence for such a unified story is thin, but the idea itself is tender. The thought that even in ruin, a people might leave behind gifts. Beneath all these questions lies one more, almost too soft to hear. Why does Atlantis stay with us so strongly? Many ancient stories have faded, but this one continues to rise in books, films, paintings, and late-night conversations. Perhaps it endures because it touches several deep feelings at once. Our love of the sea, our fear of losing what we have built, our curiosity about what might lie hidden just beyond the edge of what we can prove. Atlantis is both caution and comfort, a reminder that nothing made by human hands is eternal, and a suggestion that beauty and wisdom can still echo long after stones have fallen. If you imagine, just for a moment, the ocean at night, dark, quiet, stretching out beyond sight, you might picture, far below the surface, not a clear temple or a perfect street, but something more delicate, the idea of Atlantis itself, resting like a faint light on the seafloor of human memory. It does not need to be fully solved to be meaningful. Its unsolved mysteries drift back and forth with the tides of our attention, guiding us gently to think about pride and balance, about how we build our worlds, and how we remember them so when they are gone. And in that wide, hushed space between certainty and wonder, the legend of Atlantis continues to breathe, slowly, like the sea itself in the dark. Tonight you are listening to part 5 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move slowly through 7 quiet turning points, 7 moments when the story of Atlantis gently changed direction and set its long destiny in motion. If you imagine the whole history of the island as a circle, these points are like small stones placed along the edge, marking where the path bends, never with a sudden jolt, but with a gradual, almost unnoticed shift in course. The first turning point comes with the decision to stay. When the earlier settlers arrived, storms at their backs and uncertainty in their hearts, they could have treated Atlantis as a temporary refuge, a place to rest before sailing on. Instead, after seasons of testing the soil, watching the skies, and listening to the sea, they chose to root themselves there. Their desire was simple yet profound, to belong somewhere, to raise children who would not have to wander. Inside, Many of them struggled with fear. Fear that the island might betray them with famine or disaster. Fear that they had misread the quiet of its valleys. Outside, the wildness of the ocean and the distant threat of rival sailors pressed against them. But with the help of elders who read signs in wind and current, they learned where to build, what to plant, and how to share water. That decision to stay transformed an uncertain landing into the birth of a people. The second turning point appears when they move from scattered villages to a single planned city. At first, families live along different bays and river mouths, each community shaped by its own habits. Slowly, leaders from these settlements meet more often, brought together by trade and the need for shared defence. Their desire in this moment is for order and clarity, a structure that will prevent disputes and protect them from sudden raids or natural threats. Yet inside, there is hesitation. Some fear losing their local customs, their independence. Others worry that a central authority might grow too strong. Outside, the sea keeps bringing strangers, traders, explorers, and the occasional raider whose sails appear without warning on the horizon. Guided by wise planners and perhaps inspired by their belief in a higher order, some would say divine, they design a capital with rings of land and water, channels, bridges, and sacred spaces. This shift from many small villages to one coordinated city marks the moment when Atlantis becomes more than a scattered people. It becomes a recognizable civilization. The third turning point belongs to the discovery and use of deep resources. The hills and mountains of Atlantis hold veins of metals and stone of exceptional quality. When miners and craftsmen learn how to draw these treasures out and shape them, the island's destiny bends again. Their desire now is for refinement and strength, stronger tools, more seaworthy ships, finer ornaments for temples and homes. Internally, however, a subtle tension grows. Some elders warn that too much focus on wealth could weaken their reverence for balance, for the land and the sea that made their life possible. Externally, the world responds quickly. Traders from distant coasts become more eager, more persistent, more envious, as Atlantean goods begin to outshine others. Teachers, artisans, and spiritual guides try to hold the centre, reminding the people that resources are gifts, not guarantees. This turning point transforms Atlantis from a stable island into a rising economic power, one whose brightness begins to draw many eyes. The fourth turning point comes when Atlantis looks outward and chooses expansion over quiet sufficiency. By now, their fleets are strong, their maps are detailed, their harbours crowded. In council halls, a new question takes root. Should they be content as a prosperous island, or should they extend their influence across the sea? The desire that stirs here is ambition, not in itself evil, but hungry. Some dream of protectorates on other coasts, of tribute flowing back to the capital, of Atlantean law and order guiding less organised lands. Inside the hearts of more cautious citizens, unease grows. They fear overextension, the loss of their simple earlier virtues, the risk of awakening enemies far away. Outside, neighbouring powers watch carefully, ready to resist if Atlantis pushes too hard. Advisors and priests, acting as quiet helpers, urge moderation, treaties, and fair trade instead of ruthless conquest. Still, the decision is made to project power beyond the island. This turning point plants seeds of both glory and future conflict. The fifth turning point glows. In what many later call the Golden Age, Atlantis reaches a state where its architecture, laws, and knowledge seem to stand harmoniously together. The capital shines with orderly streets, temples aligned to the stars, and flowing water systems that astonish visitors. Their desire in this phase is to perfect what they have created, to polish their culture until it feels almost flawless. Yet inside this radiance, a more delicate inner struggle unfolds. Pride begins to whisper that they are unique not only in fortune, but in worth. Some start to see other peoples as lesser, their customs as crude. Outside, this attitude slowly reshapes relationships. Allies feel condescended to, rivals feel challenged. Wise voices still remain, philosophers, lawgivers, and spiritual leaders, who remind the Atlanteans that the higher they climb, the more carefully they must watch their balance. For a time, their influence is tempered by such guidance. But this turning point also marks the peak from which any step forward might actually be a step down. The sixth turning point unfolds as the age of friction and overreach. Pressures build on every side, demands for more wealth, calls for heavier tribute from subject lands, projects that strain the island's resources, and military campaigns that test the patience of neighbouring powers. The desire now, often unspoken, is dominance, to maintain their position at any cost, to prove that their earlier greatness was not a passing moment. Within, the Atlanteans face deeper fractures. Some citizens grow weary of endless building and distant wars, feeling nostalgia for earlier, simpler times. Others cling tightly to comfort and privilege, unwilling to give anything up. Outside, nature itself seems to turn more unpredictable. Storms grow harsher, the earth trembles more often, harvests become erratic. Counselors and priests, those quiet mentors who once held the balance, find it harder to be heard over proud voices and urgent demands. This turning point does not come as a single decision, but as a series of small choices, each one nudging Atlantis further from the harmony that once anchored it. Before the final turning point, you might notice your own small moment in time. Perhaps you are listening late at night, with the world around you dim and quiet, or in a calm corner of your day where you can let your thoughts drift. You might gently notice what hour it is, where you are, and which city or country you're listening from. If these slow journeys through history help you unwind, help you feel a little more at peace, you are always invited to stay close, to let new chapters find you, and when it feels right, to follow and subscribe to the entire history, so that these stories can keep you company whenever you need a soft voice in the dark. The seventh turning point is the one wrapped most deeply in shadow, the descent toward collapse. Myths speak of a time when the Atlanteans drift too far from the virtues that shaped their early centuries, when greed outweighs justice, when power matters more than balance, when the voice of the earth and sea is ignored. Their desire has become tangled, no longer a clear wish for home, order, or wisdom, but a restless craving that even victories cannot satisfy. Inside, many feel a strange hollowness beneath the splendor. Outside, forces converge, rival alliances, economic strain, shifting sea levels, volcanic unrest, or earthquakes. Different theories offer different details, but all point to a moment when the island systems cannot hold. There may have been warnings, a season of failed crops, a great storm that tore harbours apart, a tremor that cracked temple floors. Some would have tried to respond, to reform, to restore humility and fairness. Others may have denied the danger until it was too late. And then, whether in a single catastrophic night or over a series of bitter years, the balance finally breaks. From that final turning point forward, Atlantis is no longer a living power, but a memory sinking slowly into the sea of human imagination. Yet even this last bend in the path does not erase what came before. If you picture the 7 turning points now, they look almost like lanterns set along a dark shore, each one marking a moment when choices, desires, fears, and outside forces met and quietly changed the direction of an entire world, leaving their soft glow behind for those who still listen in the hush of night. Tonight, you are listening to part 6 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part, we will walk slowly among the people behind the legend of Atlantis, the rulers, the priests, the sailors, the craftsmen, and the quiet families whose lives turned an island into a story that would never quite fade. When we hear the word Atlantis, we often imagine grand buildings and shining canals, but every stone was lifted by real hands, every law spoken by a living voice, every prayer whispered by someone with a beating heart and private hopes. So, for a little while, we leave the big shapes of history and step closer into the streets and rooms where Atlantean lives unfolded day by day. At the top of their society stood the rulers, kings or princes, depending on the version, often said to be descendants of a line blessed by the sea god himself. In the oldest days, these leaders were not only powerful, but deeply responsible. Their strongest desire was to keep harmony between people, land, and water. They rose before dawn, listening to reports from farmers, ship captains, and temple servants. They walked along the canals to see the condition of the gates and bridges. They presided over quiet councils where disputes were settled slowly, with many voices heard. Yet even in these high hearts, there were hidden struggles. Some rulers feared they would never live up to their ancestors, that any mistake might bring misfortune to the island. Others felt the creeping pull of pride, the temptation to enjoy the symbols of power more than the work of guiding their people. Their crowns and thrones were not just ornaments, they were weights they carried, sometimes with grace, sometimes with trembling. Around them stood the councillors and judges, men and women trained to understand law and custom. Their desire was for fairness, for a system that would keep the strong from crushing the weak. They memorized long lists of precedents, listened to arguments under shaded colonnades, and watched faces closely as people spoke. Inside they struggled with doubt. Was their judgment truly just, or was it shaped by their own upbringing, their alliances, their quiet fears? Outside pressures from powerful families, merchants, and even foreign envoys pushed against their decisions. To hold the line of fairness required courage that did not shout or boast, but simply stayed steady. Then there were the priests and priestesses, keepers of ritual and story. In a world where the sea could both bless and destroy, where the earth could feed or shake, these spiritual guides tried to read meaning in patterns of wind, stars, and seasons. Their deepest desire was connection, to feel that they stood in a living relationship with the forces that shaped Atlantis, to protect that bond for everyone. They tended temples lit with the oil lamps, cared for sacred groves and springs, and told the old myths to children in soft, steady voices. Inside, many of them struggled with moments of silence from the world they served, years when prayers seemed unanswered, when storms or earthquakes came despite every ritual. They wondered if they had failed, or if the people were turning too far from balance. Outside, some skeptics questioned their authority, while ambitious leaders sometimes tried to bend religious messages to support their own plans. Still, many priests held to a quiet integrity, acting as a gentle brake when the island rushed toward excess. Far from the marble halls and temple steps, ordinary Atlanteans carried the weight and wonder of daily life. Farmers rose in the cool grey of dawn, walking out to fields irrigated by canals that glimmered under the first light. Their desire was simple and steady: good harvests, healthy animals, enough to feed their families, and offer a portion to temple and city. Inside, they wrestled with small fears: too much rain, too little rain, pests, sickness, the long uncertainty between planting and harvest. Outside, laws, taxes, and trade demands sometimes added extra strain. But the farmers were helped by knowledge passed down over generations: which crops to pair, how to rotate fields, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. In many ways, they were the quiet spine of Atlantis, holding it upright without fanfare. On the docks and in the shipyards lived the sailors and shipwrights. Their hearts were tuned to the sea's moods in a way few others could match. The sailors' desire was mixed: love of adventure, need to support their families, and a deep, almost wordless wish to return home safely from each voyage. They learned the patterns of waves and clouds, the positions of stars at different seasons, the subtle changes in wind that might mean a storm far away. Inside, they often hid their fear, especially when leaving harbour and watching the familiar shoreline sink behind them. Outside, they faced pirates, sudden storms, and the cold, indifferent vastness of open water. Their helpers were the skills passed from captain to apprentice, the strong hulls built by shipwrights who selected each plank with care, and sometimes simply luck, the kind that sailors almost never spoke about aloud. In the workshops and narrow streets of the city centre, craftsmen and craftswomen shaped the visible face of Atlantean culture. Stone cutters carved the smooth blocks that formed walls and columns. Metal workers hammered tools, weapons, and delicate ornaments that caught the light in temples and palaces. Potters spun clay on wheels, forming vessels that would travel across the sea, carrying oil, grain, and wine. Their shared desire was to make something lasting, to leave behind bowls, statues, or beams that would outlive their own brief lives. Inside, they often felt the quiet pressure of expectation, especially when working on commissions for the wealthy or the sacred. Outside, they navigated the uncertain currents of demand, fashions that changed, rulers who wanted grander works, markets that rose and fell with the success of trade. But in the pattern of their days, there was also a kind of peace, the steady rhythm of hands at work, the small hum of satisfaction when a line or curve finally felt right. We cannot forget the families who never held high office or great skill, but whose everyday care created the warmth of Atlantean life. Parents in small homes calmed crying children, cooked simple meals from grain, fish, and vegetables, and shared news by lamplight. Their desire was tenderness, to keep their loved ones safe, to give them small joys, to see them grow. Inside, they carried the usual human worries about health, money, expectations, and the future their children would face in a world that seemed both strong and fragile. Outside, they were shaped by laws, taxes, weather, and the distant decisions of rulers they might never meet. Their helpers were community ties, neighbours who watched one another's children, shared food in hard seasons, and stood together in times of loss. Of course, not every Atlantean was kind or wise. Among them were those who sought shortcuts to wealth, who lied in trade, who pushed others aside in the scramble for influence. Their desire was sharper, more impatient. They contributed to the slow internal erosion that later stories describe, the drift from balance and justice toward greed and arrogance. Yet even they were part of the human tapestry of Atlantis, reminders that no civilization is made only of heroes and sages. The true story is always mixed, noble and selfish impulses intertwined in the same streets, sometimes even in the same person. If we step back and look gently at all these figures, the rulers on their thrones, the judges in their colonnades, the priests at their altars, the farmers in their fields, the sailors on the restless sea, the artisans at their benches, the parents by their hearths, we see that Atlantis is not just a place, but a crowd of small beating hearts moving through time together. Their internal struggles and external pressures shaped every law, every harbour wall, every choice to expand or hold back. When the island later faces its hardest trials, it is these people who will feel them most directly, in their homes, their boats, their harvests, their prayers. And when the island is gone, whether in reality or only in the pages of philosophy, it is the memory of people like these that continues to live inside the legend, not only the shining towers, but the quiet footsteps that once echoed under them. You might imagine, as the night grows deeper, walking through an Atlantean street at dusk. The stones are still warm from the sun. A ruler's chariot has rolled past hours ago, leaving only faint tracks. Somewhere, a priest is finishing a last prayer. A sailor checks the ropes of his ship one more time before morning departure. A mother closes a wooden door against the cool evening air. Lamps begin to glow softly behind shuttered windows, their light falling in gentle stripes across the pavement. For a moment, everything is calm, and all the many lives of Atlantis rest together in a single quiet breath, suspended between what has been and what is yet to come. Tonight you are listening to part 7 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will spend a calm, simple day in Atlantis, walking quietly beside its people, from the first pale light of dawn to the soft darkness of night. Imagine that the city is still half asleep. The sky above the island is a gentle grey blue, and the rings of canals are calm, like bands of polished glass, circling the heart of the capital. In the distance, the sea breathes in slow waves against the outer harbours. Lamps are going out, birds are beginning to stir, and the first footsteps of the morning echo faintly on stone. This is not a day of battles or big decisions. It is just one ordinary day, and yet inside it, the whole soul of Atlantis can be felt, if we move slowly enough to notice. In a small house near one of the inner canals, a family wakes with the dawn. The father is a craftsman, a maker of tools and fittings for ships. The mother spins and weaves, turning sea-coloured threads into cloth. Their children, still drowsy, rub their eyes and stretch. Their deepest desire, though they may not say it aloud, is simple and shared. They want this day to be gentle. They want the work to go well, the meals to be enough, the weather to stay kind, the city to remain peaceful. They do not dream of ruling the seas. They dream of coming home in the evening with tired hands and quiet satisfaction. Even so, each of them carries small inner questions. The father wonders if his work is good enough to keep the favour of his customers. The mother wonders if they will be able to save enough for the children's future. The children wonder what they will become in a city so full of voices, skills, and expectations. These are not loud worries, but they hum softly beneath the surface of their day. Elsewhere, out beyond the city walls, farmers are already in the fields. The early light touches rows of crops watered by the canals that stretch like silver lines through the dark soil. A young farmer stands, hands on a wooden tool, feeling the cool air against his face. His desire is steady. He wants healthy plants, a good harvest, and the quiet pride of seeing his work feed others. Yet inside he wrestles with the fearful memories of years when rain came late, or pests ate the leaves overnight. He has learned to trust the land, but not blindly. Each season feels like a conversation with forces larger than himself, and each morning he wonders what kind of answer this day will bring. Back near the harbour, sailors prepare a small trading vessel. They check the ropes and sails, listening to the sound of the wind as carefully as a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Their desire is mixed. Part of them longs for the wide open sea, the thrill of reaching another coast. Another part simply wants to return home safely with a hold full of goods and stories. Inside they feel that familiar knot of worry just before departure, a knot made of memories of storms, broken masts and friends whose ships never came back. But they push through it with practiced motions, trusting their training, their captain, and the ship's strong hull. Around them, invisible but powerful, the outside world presses gently on this ordinary day. A distant rival port has been asking for better terms of trade. The council has been talking in recent weeks about taxes, about military readiness, about the need to maintain the grandeur of Atlantis. These discussions ripple outward into small lives without always being noticed. A slightly higher tax on goods might mean a little less silver in the craftsman's hand. A new rule about grain storage might change the farmer's routine. The sailor's route could be extended or shortened depending on new alliances. The city's great ambitions live side by side with these quiet tasks, like a large shadow cast across a courtyard where children are still playing. Yet the people of Atlantis are not alone as they move through their day. They have helpers, some visible, some more subtle. In the temples, priests and priestesses light morning fires and speak old, steady words, asking for balance between land and sea, between the pride of the powerful and the needs of the humble. On the streets, elders sit on carved benches, ready to offer advice to anyone who asks, drawing on long memories of earlier troubles and solutions. Skilled engineers inspect the gates of the canals, making sure water flows where it should, protecting fields from flood and keeping the harbour deep enough for ships. All of these quiet guardians, in their different ways, help to hold the city steady, like gentle hands keeping a bowl from tipping. By midday, the city is fully awake. Markets around the inner rings of water are alive with movement. Stalls display baskets of grain, fish laid out on cool stone, jars of oil, colourful fabrics, and small metal tools that catch the light. Children weave through the crowd, carrying messages or simply following the sound of music from a street performer with a simple flute. The craftsman from the small house has walked to his workshop. He spends the day shaping metal carefully, heating and hammering until each piece fits its purpose. A part for a rudder, a hinge for a storage chest, a hook for lifting cargo. His inner conflict, the worry about being good enough, quiets itself a little each time a customer nods in approval or returns for more work. The farmer in the fields rests for a short while under a tree, sharing bread with a neighbour and talking about the state of the canals and the colour of the sky. The sailors, once their ship is loaded, steer out past the outer rings, feeling the swell of the open sea under the hull. For them, the climax of the day is the moment when the last sight of the city slips behind a curve of land and they are alone, with waves and wind. Somewhere in the city centre, councillors meet under a shaded roof. They discuss small conflicts between neighbours, trade arrangements, minor repairs needed on public buildings. Today is not a day of great crisis. It is a day of many small decisions. Still, each choice is a thread in the larger fabric of Atlantis. Their inner struggle is always the same, to stay fair when it would be easier to favour the powerful, to think of long-term balance instead of short-term gain. Outside the council chamber, people continue their errands, often unaware of how the words spoken in that room will shape the rules of their lives. The city's strength and its hidden fragility are both built in this ordinary, unremarkable afternoon. As the sun begins to sink, the light on the canals turns golden. Shadows stretch across courtyards and tiled roofs. The craftsman returns home, his hands sore, his mind already counting tomorrow's tasks. The farmer walks back from the fields, satisfied by the look of the crops, but still scanning the horizon for any sign of changing weather. The sailors, far from home now, watch the sunset from the deck of their ship, feeling the familiar mix of beauty and distance that the sea always brings. In the temples, evening offerings are made, small portions of food, a little oil, a few quiet words asking that the island sleep safely through the night. These rituals do not erase the dangers of the world, but they give people a sense of being held in a pattern older than themselves. By nightfall, Atlantis softens. Lamps glow behind windows along the canals, reflecting in the dark water. Families gather for simple meals, sharing stories of the day, the small victories, the frustrations, the bits of news from other districts. Children grow sleepy, their heads leaning against parents' shoulders as they listen to tales of gods, heroes, and old times when the city was still young. Inside these homes, the desire that opened the day to be safe, to belong, to have enough, is felt again, now wrapped in the comfort of familiar voices and warm light. Outside, the city's structures hold fast. The walls, the bridges, the harbour walls, the ordered rings that keep land and water in balance. Yet even they are not eternal. Somewhere deep inside the earth, forces shift slowly. Somewhere far away, other powers make plans. For this one day, however, Atlantis is at rest. The craftsman lies down. The farmer closes his eyes. The sailors rock to sleep in their narrow bunks as the ship moves with the waves. The priests extinguish the last flames in the temple braziers, leaving only small embers glowing. Above it all, the stars come out, ancient and patient, watching another finished day in a civilization that believes with quiet confidence that many more days will follow. If you stand in your imagination on a high terrace overlooking the city, at this hour you would see the soft lines of streets and canals, the small clusters of lamplight, the dark curve of the distant sea. It looks peaceful, almost timeless, as if it might go on like this forever, a single ordinary day shimmering gently on the surface of history before the waters of time grow deeper and the story slowly begins to change. Tonight you are listening to part 8 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move gently into the rituals, symbols, and beliefs of the Atlanteans, the quiet inner world that shaped how they understood their island, their gods, and themselves. From the very beginning, when the first settlers stepped onto the misty shore, the people of Atlantis felt that their land was not ordinary. The rings of water and earth, the rich soil and protective mountains seemed to them like signs carefully placed by unseen hands. At dawn, when the sky was still pale and the canals shone softly, elders would tell children that the island had been lifted from the sea with intention, chosen as a meeting place between the forces of water, earth, and sky. In the oldest days, their rituals were simple: a bowl of grain poured into the waves as thanks after a good fishing trip, a stone set upright on a hill as a marker of gratitude for surviving a storm, a moment of silence before planting seeds. Their desire in all these early gestures was quiet and deep. They wanted to feel that they were not alone, that the sea that could feed or drown them was also listening, that the winds that bent their crops were part of a larger, meaningful pattern. As Atlantis grew more complex, so too did its spiritual life. Temples rose along the inner rings of the city, their columns carved with flowing lines that suggested waves and spirals of wind. At the heart of many stories stood a great sea god, later remembered by the Greeks as Poseidon, who was said to have claimed the island and divided it among noble lineages. Yet even beneath this strong image, the Atlantean faith was not only about one figure, it was a weaving of forces and symbols. Circles of water and land became sacred shapes, embodying balance. The trident, or a similar three-pronged emblem, appeared in carvings and on ceremonial staffs, representing the three elements they most feared and loved: water, earth, and storm. In their homes, people hung simple charms made of shells and polished stones, believing they carried a trace of the island's protective power. Inside each believer, however, lived small struggles that no carved symbol could erase. Some days, when crops failed or earthquakes shook the city, the faithful questioned the fairness of their gods. They wondered if a forgotten promise had been broken, if a ritual had been performed without enough sincerity, if their leader's pride was angering the powers that held the island afloat. Others wrestled with different doubts, whether the priests truly understood the divine will, whether the wealth and splendor of the temples had grown too far from the humble offerings of their ancestors. These inner conflicts did not always show on their faces as they stood in processions, but they were there, soft currents under the surface of public devotion. Outside, the world beyond Atlantis added its own challenges. Traders and emissaries from other lands brought their own stories of gods and spirits, their own rituals for rain, harvest, and safe travel. Some saw similarities and felt comforted. Others sensed competition, as if the respect for foreign beliefs might weaken their own. Political pressures also pressed inward. As Atlantis expanded and sought tribute from other regions, its rulers sometimes used religion to justify their power, claiming divine favour for their campaigns or monuments. In these moments, faith risked becoming a tool rather than a bridge, and ordinary people had to navigate the uneasy line between genuine reverence and enforced display. Yet throughout these tensions, there were gentle helpers who tried to keep the spiritual life of Atlantis steady. Among the priests and priestesses were some who lived simply, spending their days tending sacred springs, caring for temple gardens, and teaching children the older, quieter meanings of their symbols. They reminded people that an offering meant nothing if given with pride or fear alone, and that humility before the forces that created their island was more important than any grand ceremony. They taught that the rings of water and land were not only a sign of power, but of responsibility, to keep balance between taking and giving, between building and listening. On festival days, the beliefs of Atlantis came to life in ways both grand and tender. Once each year, at the beginning of the sailing season, the city would hold a great procession to honour the sea. At dawn, boats decorated with woven wreaths and bright fabrics drifted slowly along the canals, carrying singers whose voices rose and fell like waves. People lined the bridges, holding small clay lanterns whose flames flickered in the morning breeze. The desire shared in these gatherings was almost palpable. They wanted calm waters, safe voyages, and the continued goodwill of the forces that made their maritime life possible. At the climax of the ceremony, the high priest, or sometimes the ruler himself, would pour a mixture of wine, oil, and crushed grain into the water from a high platform, while the crowd fell silent. In that hush, thousands of hearts leaned toward the same hope. that the sea would accept their gift and return it as mercy. The symbols that shaped their days were not limited to festivals. A simple line of stones marking the boundary between field and canal carried meaning. It represented the delicate edge between fertile land and devouring water. The repeated motif of circles carved into doorway lintels reminded families that life, like their island, was a series of rings. Family, neighbourhood, city, sea, each affecting the others. Even the daily act of lighting a small lamp at dusk had a quiet ritual weight. For many, it was a way of pushing back the dark with a tiny, human-made star, a promise that warmth and memory would survive the night. Over time, as Atlantis rose into its golden age, the beliefs that had once been gentle guides began to feel the pull of the city's growing pride. Some rituals became more elaborate, robes more decorated, temples more ornate. The inner struggle of the people shifted. They began to ask whether their devotion was to the gods themselves or to the dazzling image of their own civilization. Yet, even in these later years, there were moments when the older spirit returned, a fisherman tossing a handful of crumbs to the waves before his first cast, whispering a thank you for all the days the sea had not taken his life. A mother teaching her child to trace a small circle on the ground before planting a tree, speaking softly of balance and roots. These small private rituals may never have been recorded in any official account, but they were as much a part of Atlantean faith as any great sacrifice on a temple altar. The result of all these layers, formal ceremonies, simple gestures, grand symbols, and whispered doubts, was a spiritual world rich and fragile at the same time. Atlantis was held together not only by stone and lore, but by shared stories about why the island existed, what it meant to live on it, and how to remain in favour with the invisible forces that surrounded them. When the island later faced its hardest trials, some would interpret earthquakes and storms as signs that the old balance had been broken, that the rings of water and land were no longer in harmony with the hearts of the people. Others would cling to the comfort of familiar symbols, lighting lamps and tracing circles even as the ground trembled. And long after the city itself was gone, if it truly vanished beneath the waves, as the legends say, what remained in human memory were not just images of shining walls, but echoes of its beliefs. An island that tried to live between pride and reverence, power and humility, land and sea. If you picture Atlantis now, in a quiet moment at twilight, you might see its temples silhouetted against a fading sky, their columns dark against the last light. On the canals, the water is smooth, reflecting a few scattered lamps. Somewhere, a priest puts out the last sacred flame for the night. Somewhere else, a child holds a small shell in their hand, wondering if it really carries the sea's protection. Above them all, the stars begin to appear, as they always have, looking down on a people who, in their rituals and symbols, were simply trying to make sense of their brief lives on an island that felt both deeply loved and always, somehow, at risk. Tonight you are listening to part 9 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift slowly over the landscapes that shaped Atlantis, the mountains and plains, the coasts and canals, the quiet fields and restless shores beneath every story we have told so far. If you imagine the island from above in soft morning light, you might see it as a single living body, a spine of hills down the centre, valleys stretching outward, and a ring of water holding it all. At its heart, Atlantis was anchored by a line of gentle mountains worn and rounded by time. Their slopes were green in kinder seasons, with forests that gave timber and game. The people looked up at these heights and felt a quiet desire for protection. The mountains stood like guardians around the basin where the main city grew. In the mornings, mist clung to their tops, then slid down into the valleys. Yet there was always a small inner struggle, an awareness that the same deep forces that had raised the mountains could one day shake them. When tremors ran through the ground, or when stones fell without warning, people felt a shiver of unease, a reminder that the island's bones were never fully still. Below those slopes, plains spread outward, shaped by rivers that carried dark soil from higher ground. These flatlands became the breadbasket of Atlantis, divided into fields that followed the curves of the land. Here, the people's desire was simple. They wanted the earth to remain generous. Each year, farmers felt a low tension as they planted seeds, never certain how rain, sun, and wind would behave. Outside them, the land answered with cool breezes, sudden showers, or dry spells that cracked the ground. To cope, the Atlanteans turned observation into a helper. Generations of watching skies and rivers taught them when to sow, when to harvest, when to let fields rest. Engineers shaped ditches and banks, guiding water so that floods would soak the earth without sweeping it away. Closer to the sea, the plains gave way to low hills and curved inlets where the land dipped into sheltered bays. These harbours were among Atlantis's greatest gifts and greatest temptations. Calm water allowed ships to anchor safely and merchants to build busy ports. Atlantis used them to open paths to the wider world, to trade, to explore, to send its influence outward. Yet sailors and elders kept a wary respect for the thin edge where land ended and sea began. They knew how quickly a quiet bay could turn dangerous under storm winds, how a misjudged depth could tear open a hull. Outside, the ocean pressed at the coast in slow but constant ways, eroding cliffs, shifting sandbars, altering channels over time. It was as if the sea were both holding the island and quietly testing its strength. The famous rings of land and water around the capital were answers to this geography. The city sat in a shallow basin near the shore, where rivers met the sea in a tangle of channels and marshes. Early builders saw this pattern, and guided by their wish for beauty and defence, deepened and straightened the waterways, raising banks and building bridges until the city became a set of wide circles. At the centre stood the royal and sacred precincts. Around them lay homes, markets and workshops. Beyond those, more water, then farmland, then open island. The design turned the landscape into a helper. Rings that could slow invaders, channels that could move goods smoothly, a visible reminder of the balance they sought between order and flow. Yet in private, some engineers and guardians must have wondered whether they were truly in control or only arranging the land in a pattern that would one day be tested. Outside their walls, heavy rains, swollen rivers, and the occasional sea surge pressed against gates and embankments, demanding constant care. The climate that wrapped around Atlantis added another gentle layer. Warm currents in the surrounding seas brought mild winters and long growing seasons. Sea breezes cooled summer afternoons, drifting inland across fields and roofs. Over time, the Atlanteans came to feel that their island was favoured. Sunlight that helped crops, winds that filled sails, rains that often arrived just in time. Their desire was to keep this pattern unchanged, but memory held other years, seasons of harsh storms or stubborn drought, when careful plans failed. Beyond anything they could see, larger forces were always moving, currents shifting, pressure building deep underground, air and water changing in slow cycles longer than any one life. Forests and wetlands also shaped Atlantis in quiet ways. On higher slopes, woods held soil in place and slowed the rush of rainwater. In lowlands, marshes absorbed floods and sheltered fish and birds. The urge to use these places to cut more trees, to drain more marsh, to widen fields, pulled against a sense that each change carried risk. Some thinkers and priests likely warned against stripping hills bare or filling too many wetlands, but the needs of a growing population and the certainty of successful rulers often push caution aside. The landscapes replied with simple results. Hillsides more prone to sliding after heavy rain, rivers running faster when their banks were narrowed, shorelines shifting as mud and sand found new paths. Slowly, the very strengths of Atlantis' geography, its rich plains, its safe harbours, its soft climate, its veins of stone and metal, became threads in a web of vulnerability. People used to abundance did not always notice the first faint signs of strain. Fields that had always yielded could begin to tire. Harbours, once safe, could feel crowded and harder to guard. If the mountains shook or hidden fire stirred beneath the island, the same deep energy that had lifted Atlantis from the sea could start to threaten it. Inside many hearts, trust in the land's kindness began to share space with a quieter fear that it might not always provide. Outside, the wider world pressed more firmly. Rivals sought control of sea lanes. Storms struck busy coasts, and small rises in water level made low-lying districts more fragile than maps suggested. Through all of this, the Atlanteans leaned on their understanding of their environment as both shield and teacher. Engineers watched rivers and tides, adjusting canals when rainy seasons swelled the water. Farmers tried new methods and new crops, searching for plants that could endure harder years. Ship captains mapped safe routes along reefs and through narrow channels until their paths formed a kind of memory written on the sea. These careful habits were their quiet allies, standing between them and the harsher moods of land and water. And yet knowledge and skill, for all their value, could not fully silence the slow movements of earth and ocean beneath and around the island. If you picture Atlantis now, not from above, but from the ground, you might stand on a low hill just outside the capital at the end of a long day. Behind you, the mountains rise in soft layers, their tops already turning blue in the fading light. Before you, the rings of land and water encircle the city like ripples paused on a pond. To your right and left, fields stretch toward the horizon, their furrows holding the last traces of gold from the sun. Far ahead, beyond the final curve of buildings and the outer harbour, the open sea gleams, its surface calm, its depths unreadable. The wind brushes across your face, carrying the mingled scents of salt and soil. In that quiet moment, the island feels both strong and very delicate, an elegant shape of earth and water resting over deep, unseen power, balanced for now, while the sky slowly darkens above it, and the first stars open like small, patient lights along the edge of the night. Tonight you are listening to part 10 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move slowly through conflicts, alliances and quiet shifts of power, the soft but steady currents beneath the bright surface of Atlantis. From the outside, a golden age often looks smooth and unbroken, like the calm face of a harbour at dawn. But if you stand closer, in corridors and council halls, you begin to notice small tensions, competing desires, and careful bargains that keep a great society together or slowly pull it apart. In Atlantis, power was never fixed. It drifted, gathered, and changed hands, sometimes gently, sometimes like distant thunder over a quiet sea. In early days, when the island settlements were still young, conflict was simple and close to the ground. Neighbours argued over water rights, grazing land, and the lines between fields. Each family wanted enough. Enough land, enough water, enough safety for their children. In hard years, when harvests were thin or storms had damaged homes, old grudges woke easily. Outside, the push of weather and scarcity turned small quarrels into sharper disputes. Yet even then, alliances formed as a natural answer. Families joined through marriage, villages agreed to share wells and canals, elders walked from place to place to mediate. These early alliances were like ropes, tying scattered households into the first outline of a nation. As the capital grew and the rings of land and water took shape, conflict rose from fences to policy and pride. The rulers of Atlantis now carried a wider desire, not only to keep peace within, but to expand influence beyond. In the high chambers of the council, voices met in gentle disagreement. Some urged cautious trade and limited obligations, fearing that overreach would anger neighbours and the deeper powers of sea and earth. Others, carried by confidence in ships and walls, dreamed of protectorates, tribute, and a belt of territories looking to Atlantis for law. Within each ruling mind, duty and ambition pulled against one another. The wish to be a wise guardian, the temptation to be a celebrated conqueror. Outside, the world answered each decision. Ports either opened to Atlantean ships or strengthened their defences. Distant rulers either offered friendship or began to whisper about resistance. Out of this mix of hope and unease grew the first great alliances with other powers. Some were sealed in formal treaties marked by carved stones and ceremonies beside the sea. Others were softer, built on repeated trade, mutual defence, and shared worry about a third, more dangerous neighbour. For a time, these alliances stood like pillars, holding up a broad roof of peace. Merchant fleets passed safely along agreed routes. Soldiers drilled, mostly for show. Emissaries travelled with measured, polite words. All sides wanted the same thing, to enjoy Atlantean skill and wealth without giving up too much independence. Yet every ally carried private doubts. Would Atlantis remain a partner or slowly become a master? Would the ringed city across the water listen when smaller voices said no? Or would it insist? Within Atlantis, alliances formed not only between states, but between groups and classes. Merchant houses, priestly circles, military captains, and old noble families each had their own centres of gravity. They cooperated, competed, and quietly measured one another's strength. A merchant house might back a naval plan for increased patrols, hoping to protect its shipping, while a group of priests resisted the same plan as a step toward unnecessary war. These alliances were not always written. They lived in shared meals, exchanged favours, and the soft promise, support me now, and I will remember you later. Inside those who walked this web, loyalty and self-preservation tugged at each other. Outside, the effects showed in which temples were repaired, which laws were enforced strictly or gently, and which voices were granted space in the council. Not all conflicts could be softened by talk. Along distant coasts, local rulers bristled at Atlantean demands for tribute or special trade. Skirmishes broke out when merchants were attacked, or when strongholds refused to honour agreements. Atlantis wanted to reassert control without appearing weak. Naval expeditions sailed not as full wars, but as reminders. A blockade here, a seized ship there, a show of force in a disputed bay. In the hearts of sailors and soldiers, feelings were mixed. Some felt pride in defending their island's interests, others sensed that each stern act might plant seeds of long resentment. Farther away, other states watched and weighed whether alliance with Atlantis promised safety or slow subordination. Inside the island, power itself began to tilt and slide in quieter ways. In earlier centuries, Kings or princes had ruled with broad authority, guided by tradition and the counsel of priests and elders. As trade grew and wealth pooled in certain hands, rich merchant families and influential officials found their voices growing louder. They formed alliances of convenience with key figures in temples or army, promising donations, sponsorship of public works, and help in advancing relatives' careers. Their desire was clear, not just a seat at the table, but a hand on the steering oar of the state. Even the most devout or patriotic among them felt the soft pull of self-interest. Outside, ordinary citizens began to sense that some decisions favoured the few more than the many. There were times when reform-minded rulers or councils tried to rebalance things. They rewrote laws, limited certain offices to short terms, or created new assemblies where more citizens could speak. They were helped by quiet allies, philosophers who wrote of justice, priests who repeated old teachings about modesty and fairness, judges who insisted that even the powerful must answer to the law. For a while, reforms calmed the waters. Conflicts that might have exploded into revolt were redirected into debate and compromise. Yet no balance held forever. Over years, old patterns crept back, like a path that reappears in the grass no matter how often it is covered. The most dangerous shifts of power came under the pressure of fear. A string of bad storms, a failing alliance abroad, rumours of rival fleets gathering beyond the horizon, each sent unease through the capital. The desire for strong, decisive leadership grew louder than the wish for shared, careful rule. In such times, a single general, priest, or politician could gather unusual influence by promising safety in exchange for trust. At first, that person might be sincere, convinced they alone could protect Atlantis, but power gathered too quickly is heavy. The temptation to keep it a little longer, to quiet critics for the common good, could slip in almost unnoticed. Outside, laws shifted by small degrees, patrols grew more visible, public speech narrowed, market whispers softened, not because worries were gone, but because people were no longer sure it was wise to voice them. Through all these high shifts, warm, steady alliances still held ordinary life together, between neighbours, between guild members, between families who helped one another in sickness or loss. These bonds never entered official records, yet they formed a quiet structure beneath the formal one. When conflicts far away disrupted trade, it was these small alliances that shared food and tools. When a dispute between factions threatened to spill into the streets, respected elders, local leaders, and temple servants often persuaded both sides to stand back, to talk first, to remember they shared the same narrow ring of land in the same wide sea. If you imagine Atlantis now, at the height of its power, you may see shining avenues, crowded markets, and ships moving in and out of its harbours with the easy rhythm of breath. But if you listen more closely, behind the noise of trade and the clear words of ceremony, you would hear softer sounds, careful arguments in council chambers, private promises in shaded gardens, quiet prayers of citizens who sense that forces beyond their reach are shaping what comes next. Power moves through these spaces like an unseen current, carried by trust, fear, hope, and memory. Sometimes it holds the island together, sometimes it pulls at the seams. And always, just beyond the edge of law and ambition, the sea waits, patient and watchful, as if it knows that every human arrangement, no matter how clever or grand, is only a pattern traced in wet sand before the long tide slowly returns. Tonight you are listening to part 11 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move slowly through the economy, trade and resources of Atlantis, the quiet systems of giving and taking that kept the island alive beneath its myths of glory. People often picture shining palaces and proud ships, but none of that could have existed without grain in storerooms, timber in yards, metals in workshops, and patient hands turning raw materials into useful things. To understand Atlantis, we have to imagine not only its kings and temples, but its markets at dawn and its quarries in the hills. From the beginning, the heart of Atlantean wealth lay in the land itself. The plains below the mountains, fed by rivers and canals, yielded grain, vegetables, and fruit in generous seasons. Farmers walked their fields with a quiet desire, enough for their families, enough for offerings, and enough to sell so they could buy what they could not grow. The soil answered their effort most years. Orchards gave figs and olives, vineyards climbed gentle slopes, herds grazed on higher pastures. This steady abundance created more than full stomachs. It created confidence. Inside many hearts grew the feeling that their island was favoured, that it would always give them a little more than they needed. Yet with that comfort came a soft inner struggle. When harvests were very good, some began to hoard, to think in terms of mine instead of ours, to worry less about fairness and more about high granaries and locked storerooms. Beyond the fields, the island held hidden veins of wealth in its stone. The hills and low mountains contained metals and sound-building rock. Miners chipped passages into the earth. What they brought out, copper, tin, iron, and rarer shining metals, became the bones of Atlantean craft. In open yards, metal workers hammered tools, blades, and ornaments. Stone cutters shaped blocks for walls and columns and polished panels for temples and halls. Their desire was not only to earn their bread, but to leave behind work that felt solid and respected. Inside, however, they lived with fatigue, danger, and the knowledge that wealth drawn from the earth was not shared equally. Some saw their finest pieces carried off to upper halls they would never enter. The sea, too, was a vast resource, and the Atlanteans treated it as both pantry and road. Fishers sailed out at dawn, nets folded like sleeping birds. The catch returned as baskets of silver bodies, feeding markets each day. But the greater wealth came from what moved across the water rather than what swam within it. Ships left Atlantis loaded with grain, oil, wine, crafted goods, and worked metal. They came back bearing timber from distant forests, rare stones, dyes, spices, and news. Over time, trade routes braided themselves across the sea, connecting Atlantis to many coasts. The island became a hub, a place where goods from one region met goods from another and were sent onward. With this web of exchange, a more complex economy emerged. Markets in the capital's rings filled with stalls, each one a small point where the larger system touched daily life. You could imagine walking there on a soft morning, jars of oil lined in rows, bread still warm, bolts of cloth stacked in shade, metal tools laid out in careful order. Buyers moved between them with coins or measured weights, haggling in low voices. Their desire was familiar, to spend wisely, to feel they had not been cheated, to bring home something that would make life smoother. Inside, many felt the quiet pull of comparison. Who had finer fabrics? Who could afford a little spice? Who had more jars stored safely away? Outside the island, Atlantean trade and resource use stirred deeper currents. Some neighbouring lands welcomed their ships, glad to sell timber or ore in exchange for finished goods and grain. Others watched with suspicion as Atlantean merchants bought land, built warehouses, or pressed for special rights in foreign ports. The more Atlantis depended on certain outside resources, great trees for shipbuilding, or rare metals for ornaments and sacred objects, the more tightly it was bound to those distant shores. Any change there, a new ruler, a bad harvest, a conflict, could ripple back to the ringed city. To manage all this, Atlantis relied on layers of quiet helpers. Scribes kept records of storehouses, taxes, and shipments. Harbour officials tracked which ships came in and out, counted cargo, and levied duties. Priests oversaw temple treasuries where offerings were stored and sometimes released during hard years to support the poor or to fund public works seen as sacred. Thoughtful rulers tried to keep the flow balanced. Laws limited some hoarding, organised grain reserves, and set fair weights and measures. Inside themselves, those rulers fought a private battle. They wanted wealth to display the greatness of Atlantis, but they also knew that too much display could stir envy and resentment, both at home and abroad. For a long time, the system worked. The result was a humming prosperity that touched many levels of society. Bakers could rely on flour arriving on time, shipbuilders could find wood and metal for nails and fittings, households could expect oil for lamps through the winter, public fountains flowed, temple festivals had enough food to share, and major works, new canals, bridges and halls, could be funded without stripping the people bare. From the outside, it might have seemed as if Atlantis had solved the puzzle of plenty. But beneath that smooth surface, small cracks began to form. As trade expanded, some merchant houses and officials grew far richer than others. Estates on the outskirts of the capital spread across wide stretches of land, while small farmers felt pressure from debts or tithes. Inside these lesser homes, a different kind of desire began to grow, not for luxury, but for fairness, for a share that felt less fragile. At the same time, reliance on distant resources made Atlantis vulnerable. A failed timber harvest in one region could delay shipbuilding. A conflict in another could cut off access to a rare mineral. Storms that scattered fleets did not only cost lives, they shook the pillars of the economy itself. Nature, too, remained an unpredictable partner. Years of good weather encouraged expansion. New fields cut into hillsides, more marshes drained, more quarries opened. When harsher years came, eroded slopes and tired soils answered with reduced yields. Heavy storms silted up harbours and canals, demanding costly dredging. In such times, leaders faced hard choices, whether to use reserves to ease the people's burdens, or to keep savings for grand projects and foreign ventures. Their decisions slowly shifted trust. Some choices cemented loyalty, others deepened quiet bitterness. If you stand in imagination on a vantage point above the capital at the end of a trading day, you might see both sides of this system at once. In the harbours, hands unload ships, moving crates and amphorae in a steady rhythm. In the markets, the last customers hurry between stalls as sellers pack their goods. Smoke rises from workshops where embers still glow under cooling metal. From a distance, it is one calm picture. An island at work, sustained by its land, its mines, and its sea roads. But if you look closer, you see faces. Tired, hopeful, worried, proud. You sense debts that must be paid, bargains that were hard, shipments that arrived just in time or a little too late. Atlantis's economy, trade and resources did not exist. Apart from its soul, they were part of it. The desire for security and abundance shaped many of its choices, as did the quiet fear of losing what had been gained. For years the balance held. Fields still yielded, ships still sailed, markets still opened each morning. And in the silent spaces between ships' arrivals, between one harvest and the next, between coins changing hands, something delicate was always being tested. The thin line between using the world wisely and asking more from it than it could safely give. Tonight you are listening to part 12 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move slowly through the material world of Atlantis, the clothing, tools, and architecture that shaped daily life and revealed the values of its people. When we imagine a civilization, we often picture its grand ideas, its legends, its rulers. But the truth of any society lies just as much in the things people touched every day: the roughness of a weaving loom, the weight of a metal tool, the sound of footsteps on stone floors, the comfort of a cloak against evening wind. In Atlantis, these small physical details created the quiet texture of life, as real as the gleaming temples and the stories of kings. At dawn, when the city was still cool, workers and families stepped out into streets wearing clothing woven from natural fibres: linen, wool, and sometimes fine cloth imported through trade. Most garments were simple and practical: tunics tied with belts, short cloaks for warmth, sandals made from woven reeds or leather. The desire behind these garments was always the same: protection, comfort, and a sense of belonging. Common folk needed clothes that allowed them to harvest fields, tend animals, craft tools, and walk long distances. Inside, though, many felt a soft inner tension. The wealthy wore dyed fabrics, embroidered hems, or metal clasps shaped by skilled hands. These touches created small differences that marked status, and even those who did not envy them noticed them. Clothes could unite people in shared purpose, but they could also divide them in subtle, quiet ways. Tools formed another layer of daily life. In the workshops near the inner rings of the city, metal workers shaped copper, tin, and iron into blades, ploughs, hinges, and ornaments. The clang of hammer on metal echoed through the morning air. Farmers carried metal-tipped ploughs into the fields. Sailors relied on strong metal fastenings in their ships. Every tool reflected both necessity and pride, a desire to shape the world more efficiently, more safely, more beautifully. Yet each tool also carried an inner conflict. Tools could serve the common good, but they could also feed ambition. Better weapons could defend the island, but they could also tempt rulers to expand farther than wisdom allowed. Better mining tools could draw more resources, but they could also deepen the strain on mountains and rivers. Wood, stone, and clay formed the backbone of Atlantis' built world. In the lowlands and foothills, forests provided timber for homes, beams, roofs, and the great shipyards. The scent of fresh-cut wood drifted along the streets during construction seasons. Stone cutters took blocks from quarries in the hills and shaped them into slabs, pillars, and paving stones. Their desire was simple: stability. A well-built home could shelter a family safely. A strong bridge could support the weight of carts and merchants. But here too lived a quiet struggle. Each choice of material, each tree cut, each stone lifted from the earth, left a mark on the land. Some craftsmen, especially elders who had watched forests thin and quarries deepen, carried a soft worry about taking too much. Outside, the island answered in its own quiet language: more erosion on hillsides, more need for canal repairs, more shifts in soil where the ground had been opened. As the city entered its golden age, architecture became one of its proudest expressions. Along the innermost rings, grand structures rose: temples with tall columns, government halls with wide steps, storage complexes with carefully measured chambers. Buildings were aligned with canals, courtyards, and public squares, creating a sense of harmony between water, stone, and light. The desire shaping this architecture was more than practicality. It was beauty, order, and the feeling that Atlantis was designed with intention, not accident. Sunlight touched walls at calculated angles, and the sound of flowing water echoed naturally through open spaces. Inside these halls, however, lived another quiet conflict. As buildings grew more ornate, as carvings became more intricate and walls taller, some citizens felt pride swell into something sharper, something like superiority. The temple's columns grew grander each generation, the palaces more decorated. What began as reverence for beauty risked drifting into hunger for display. Outside, this shift could be sensed as well. Visiting traders admired the city's grandeur, but sometimes left uneasy, wondering whether a society so invested in splendour had forgotten how easily stone could crack under pressure. Homes told quieter stories. In the outer rings, houses were modest, small courtyards, painted walls, simple pottery on shelves. Families cooked over hearths, stored grain in clay jars, and hung tools at their doorways. These homes were shaped by necessity and love, not grandeur. Their desire was warmth, safety, familiar spaces for children to sleep. Even in wealthier districts where homes had carved pillars and decorated floors, the heartbeat of domestic life was the same, and within those walls people faced the same inner struggles found in any age: the burden of providing enough, the quiet hope for better days, the fear of illness or misfortune. Pottery, perhaps the most fragile of all materials, revealed the daily rhythm of Atlantis. Clay cups, bowls, jars, and lamps filled every home. Some were plain, others carried patterns of waves, spirals, and circles that echoed the island's geography. These vessels held grain, oil, water, and light itself. The desire behind them was simple: to hold what was precious. And yet pottery also carried symbolism. A cracked jar warned of scarcity. A well-fired pot gave confidence. In workshops, artisans debated shapes, glazes, and designs, wanting each piece to be both useful and pleasing. Outside these walls, broken shards from centuries past lay buried in soil, mute witnesses to meals eaten, lamps lit, and lives lived quietly. Ships were perhaps the greatest expression of Atlantean material skill. In the shipyards, craftsmen shaped long timbers into curved hulls, reinforced with metal pins and ropes of woven fibre. The desire embedded in each ship was powerful: safety on the sea, speed in trade, glory in foreign harbours. Inside, shipwrights knew the responsibility held in each beam. A miscut board or a weak joint could mean disaster far from land. Outside, the sea tested every ship without mercy. A vessel launched with celebration could meet storms only days later, its survival depending on every choice made in the yard. When we gather all these materials, cloth, wood, metal, clay, stone, we see a picture of Atlantis not just as a legend, but as a living place full of hands, tools, and small daily decisions. Each object held a story: of work done well, of pride or humility, of care or excess. The island's greatness rested on these ordinary things. When the people used them wisely, the city grew stronger. When pride guided their choices more than balance, slow cracks formed, not in the stone alone, but in the values that stone was meant to protect. If you imagine standing now in a quiet street of Atlantis at sunset, you might see a mason brushing dust from a carved block, a weaver rolling up her loom for the night, a child carrying a clay lamp that flickers as he walks. Behind them, tall buildings glow in the last light. Each material, each texture, each object is a thread in the woven fabric of their world. And as night gathers around the city, the stones cool, the lamps flicker, and the tools rest, holding in their silence the story of how much care, belief, and desire once shaped this island from the ground up. Tonight you are listening to part 13 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift gently into the core myths and quiet variations of the Atlantis story. The different ways people have imagined this island, each version reflecting a slightly different hope, fear, or question in the human heart. When we speak of Atlantis, we are not only speaking of one fixed tale, but of a cluster of stories that circle the same shadowed shape beneath the waves. At the centre of nearly all of them lies the account given by the philosopher Plato, long after the island itself was said to have vanished. In his telling, Atlantis was once a great island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, rich in resources, ordered in rings of land and water, ruled by kings who at first were just and measured. Their deepest desire, in this early phase, was to live in harmony with the gift that had been entrusted to them, a land lifted from the sea, favoured by the gods, offering wealth without immediate ruin. They built temples, organised laws, and maintained balance between their strength and their reverence. But as the generations passed, Plato says, something shifted inside them. The Atlanteans slowly let desire for power, luxury, and domination grow louder than the older call to moderation. This is the inner struggle at the heart of the core myth, a people torn between their higher, disciplined nature and their lower, grasping impulses. Outside them, the world watched. The gods, who had once granted the island its blessings, observed the creeping change, and other lands felt the pressure of Atlantean ambition. Atlantis began to press outward, threatening to subdue those beyond the sea, moving from partner to would-be master. In Plato's story, the antagonist is not a monster or a single enemy general, but a mixture of forces. The pride of Atlantis itself, and the quiet anger of both the divine and the wider human world that feels this pride as a weight. As the island rises in might, another city appears in the narrative as a mirror and a foil. Ancient Athens, portrayed as a more virtuous, disciplined power that resists Atlantean aggression. The Athenians, in this version, become the unexpected helpers in the moral arc of the story, standing for order and self-control against the swelling tide of Atlantean excess. The climax of Plato's myth comes when this tension can no longer be sustained. Atlantis, having turned too far from its original balance, faces judgment. According to the tale, in a single dreadful day and night of earthquakes and floods, the island is shaken, broken, and swallowed by the sea. The result is both simple and haunting. A brilliant civilization vanishes, leaving behind only troubled currents and stories carried forward in memory. For Plato, the lingering resonance of this ending is clear. Atlantis becomes a warning, a mirror held up to his own city and to all future states. No matter how advanced or powerful a society becomes, if it loses its inner balance, it risks sinking beneath the waves of its own greed. Around this core myth, later centuries began to spin variations, each revealing something about the people who told them. Some retellings soften Atlantis, turning it from a proud aggressor into more of a tragic victim, a place of advanced knowledge and gentle wisdom destroyed by a cruel twist of nature or by the jealousy of lesser nations. In these versions, the desire of the storytellers is different. They long for a lost paradise, a golden age where humans lived closer to beauty, harmony, or perhaps even to forgotten technologies. The inner struggle in these tales lies not so much within Atlantis itself, but within the listener, the ache of thinking that something perfect or nearly perfect was lost before we had a chance to know it. Outside, the antagonists become storms, earthquakes, jealous gods, or envious neighbours, forces that seem to punish Atlantis not for its corruption but for its brilliance. In this gentler variant, helpers appear in the form of noble survivors who, in some legends, escape the sinking island and bring their knowledge to new lands. They teach farming, building, astronomy, or sacred rites, seeding the world with fragments of Atlantean wisdom. The result is a different kind of echo. Instead of a warning against pride, the story becomes a whisper that our present cultures may carry traces, however faint, of a drowned inheritance. Other variants push Atlantis into stranger shapes. Some late traditions and speculative writings imagine it as a place of near magical science, far beyond the surrounding world, crystal technologies, almost flight-like ships, energy drawn from unknown sources. In these versions, the desire driving the myth is curiosity about the limits of human capability, how far knowledge might go if given freedom and time. The inner conflict becomes the same as in many of our modern tales, whether human beings can handle great power without breaking themselves. The antagonist, once again, is both inside and outside, hubris on the one hand, and perhaps the harsh, indifferent laws of nature on the other. These stories often reach their climax with experiments gone wrong, forces unleashed that even Atlantean genius cannot control. The island's fall then reads less like moral punishment and more like a tragic accident at the edge of possible knowledge. The result and lingering feeling here is a mix of awe and unease, admiration for what might have been achieved, and anxiety about what happens when discovery outruns wisdom. There are also quieter, more symbolic interpretations woven by philosophers, mystics, and modern scholars who see Atlantis not as a literal place, but as an allegory of the soul or of cycles in history. In these readings, the desire behind the myth is understanding rather than adventure. Atlantis becomes a way to talk about how individuals or societies rise and fall inwardly, how we begin in simplicity, gain strength, slowly complicate our lives, and then risk losing ourselves in the complexity we created. The inner struggle here is almost gentle, between the part of us that wants to live modestly and the part that craves more influence, more comfort, more certainty. The outside forces, wars, disasters, enemies, are seen as reflections of that inner imbalance rather than separate causes. In these symbolic versions, helpers take the form of wisdom traditions, ethical teachings, and disciplines that try to call us back to centre before our personal islands sink. The climax is not always a literal cataclysm, but a moment of realization or collapse in which we see the cost of forgetting what truly holds us steady. The result is a myth that lingers not as a historical puzzle, but as a soft question in the mind. Where in my own life am I building Atlantis, and where am I risking its fall? Across all these variants, Plato's severe warning, the lost paradise, the super science dream, the inner allegory, one thing remains constant. Atlantis is always at the edge, a place between known land and deep water. It is always both shining and fragile. This shape never fully changes, no matter how the details shift. Perhaps that is why the myth endures when so many others have grown quiet. It holds within it our desire to imagine greatness, our fear of losing it, our inner struggle between humility and pride, our sense that there are forces outside us, nature, time, chance, that we can never fully command. The helpers in the story, whether wise Athenians, noble refugees, or teachers of balance, remind us that not all is doom. There are always voices trying to guide us back to safer ground. And yet, in almost every telling, those voices are not quite enough to stop the final descent. If you picture Atlantis now as it lives in the world's imagination, you do not see one single clear city. You see many overlapping images. A ringed island under a bright sky, a gleaming utopia trembling before a storm, a proud navy sailing out against distant shores, a quiet people whose lamps are still burning when the ground begins to shake, a symbol written in the margins of a philosopher's dialogue, a whispered rumour among sailors of ruins far below. These layers do not cancel one another. They float together like faint reflections on dark water. As night deepens around your own thoughts, the myth of Atlantis becomes less a fixed picture and more a shifting glow just under the surface of the mind, sometimes warning, sometimes mourning, sometimes simply inviting you to wonder what might lie just beyond the last charted line on the map, where memory, fear, and longing meet in the quiet roll of an invisible sea. Tonight you are listening to part 14 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will move gently into the indigenous knowledge and quiet survival strategies of the Atlanteans, the ways they learned to listen to their island and sea so closely that wisdom became as natural to them as breathing. Long before their engineers drew plans on tablets, before proud rulers spoke of expansion and tribute, there were older forms of knowing, passed from hand to hand and voice to voice, like small lamps carried carefully through the dark. This knowledge began in simple observation. Fishermen who noticed how certain winds brought specific kinds of waves, farmers who watched how a thin veil of cloud across the sun foretold a change in weather, shepherds who learned which slopes stayed safer in heavy rains. Their deepest desire was modest but profound, to stay alive with some measure of dignity, to feed their families, to shelter their homes, to keep their island's fragile balance intact. They did not think of themselves as wise in any grand way. They simply wanted to understand enough of the world's moods so that surprise did not always mean disaster. Yet even as they learned, they carried a quiet inner struggle. Nature could be read, but never fully tamed. A fisherman who had survived many storms could still be caught by one that rose too quickly. A farmer who had memorized the sky's language could still see crops ruined by a rare combination of heat and wind. Deep inside, Atlanteans lived between confidence and humility. They trusted their inherited knowledge, but they also knew it had edges, places where it ended and the unknown began. Their survival strategies began with the land. Elders taught that fields should not be pushed past their strength. Certain plots were to be rested in a patterned rhythm, left fallow or planted with soil-healing crops. They knew not from theory, but from long memory. That soil which is always asked to give and never allowed to recover turns thin and bitter. They learned which grains could endure a drier year, which roots reached deeper for water, which trees to plant along the edges of fields to break the force of wind and hold earth in place. Children absorbed these lessons not from lectures, but from walking beside parents and grandparents at dawn, listening to simple sentences. See how the water runs here, not there? Plant this higher on the slope. It fears wet feet. When that mountain cloud looks like a veil, work faster. Rain is coming. These phrases were like small spells, shaping habits that kept both land and people from being exhausted too quickly. Along the coasts, indigenous sea knowledge grew just as deep. Sailors did not rely on sight alone. They felt the sea through the hull and the air on their skin. They could tell, from the pattern of waves against the shore, how the wind was shifting far beyond the horizon. They watched the flight of seabirds, noting when they stayed close to land or ventured out boldly. They knew which parts of the coastline swallowed ships in bad weather and which coves offered real shelter. Many of these teachings were wrapped in stories, tales of careless captains who ignored a certain sign and never returned, of wise old sailors who trusted the voice of the sea more than their own impatience. Behind the stories was a simple survival rule. When in doubt, believe the patterns that have kept you safe, not the urge to rush forward. Yet even the most cautious sailors fought an inner conflict between the desire for one more day of travel, one more distant bargain, and the whisper of instinct telling them to turn back. The Atlanteans also carried knowledge of shaking ground and restless water. Living on an island formed by deep forces, they learned to read small warnings. Dogs barking strangely at night, wells that tasted different, springs that ran muddier than usual. All could be taken as hints that something beneath the earth was stirring. In some districts, homes were built with flexibility in mind. Wooden frames that could sway, walls that relied more on interlocking pieces than on brittle towering stone. In the low-lying areas near the outer rings, older families remembered stories of high waters that had once swept farther inland, and so they argued for raised thresholds, for embankments kept in good repair, for storage jars placed where water could not reach them easily. These were not perfect shields against earthquakes or floods, but they were small strategies that turned some catastrophes into manageable trials instead of final endings. The inner struggle here lay in the tension between memory and forgetfulness. After many quiet years, younger generations would sometimes grow impatient with cautious building or extra work on canal banks. It took patient elders repeating old tales beside evening lamps to keep that caution alive. Their survival knowledge extended into social life as well. Atlanteans understood that no family could stand entirely alone against a bad harvest, an illness, or a storm that tore roofs away. In villages and city districts, it was customary for neighbours to pool certain tools, to share grain in lean weeks, to help rebuild a damaged wall or roof. These customs were not written in law codes. They were held in the soft law of expectation and shame. We helped you last year. You will help us next time. Underneath this lay a subtle skill. Knowing how far a community could stretch to support its members before breaking. Wise leaders and elders watched for signs of strain, arguments over small debts, harder eyes at market stalls, sudden silence in public gatherings. When they sensed that tension rising, some would call for shared feasts, temple distributions of stored grain, or public works that gave people a way to earn what they needed, rather than beg for it. These acts were not grand gestures of policy, as much as they were survival strategies aimed at keeping the social fabric from tearing in times when fear and scarcity pressed in from outside. The natural world itself was treated as a teacher. Certain birds were watched as seasonal messengers. Certain flowers were known to bloom only when the weather would soon turn. The colour of the sea at specific times of year, the smell of the air before a storm, the way clouds stacked over distant peaks, all these formed a kind of living script that Atlanteans learned to read. They did not think of it as science in a modern sense. It was simply how one stayed alive. Their rituals often served double duty. A festival that honoured the sea at the start of the sailing season was also a way to check the condition of ships, to review safety rules, to remind captains of routes and harbours. A ceremony before planting was as much about agreeing on timing and field use as it was about pleasing any god. The helpers in this system were not only priests but also quiet experts, older farmers, seasoned sailors, healers who knew which herbs grew, where and how to store them against winter illness. Despite all this, the Atlanteans could never erase the fact that some forces lay beyond even the best survival wisdom. A series of storms could come too close together, undoing the careful work of years. A quake could crack the most prudently built home. A sudden disease carried by foreign traders could spread faster than healers could respond. In those moments, their indigenous knowledge did not fail. It simply reached its limit. The result was a different kind of survival, measured not just in full storerooms or intact buildings, but in resilience, the ability to grieve, to adapt, to rebuild. Stories of past hardships told and retold became a kind of emotional map, proof that the island had suffered before and still found ways to stand. Children grew up knowing not only how to avoid danger, but how to live through it, when avoidance was no longer possible. If you imagine Atlantis now in the quiet before dawn, you might see this knowledge at work in small, almost invisible ways. A farmer pauses, feeling the soil between his fingers a little longer than usual before deciding how much seed to scatter. A sailor, already halfway to the harbour, stops, turns his head toward the wind, and chooses to delay departure by a few hours. An elder, hearing a certain sharpness in voices at the marketplace, proposes a shared meal in the coming days to ease rising tension. None of these acts would be sung in the great myths, yet they are part of the reason Atlantis lasted as long as it did. Beneath the high stories of kings and temples lay this quieter layer of wisdom, an old, patient understanding of land, sea, and human hearts. It did not make the island immortal, but for many generations it allowed Atlantis to move with, rather than against, the forces that surrounded it, like a small, skillful boat adjusting its sails to stay upright on a vast, shifting sea. Tonight you are listening to part 15 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift slowly through the long moment when Atlantis truly met the wider world, when its ships, ideas, and pride reached far beyond the circle of its own horizon, and the sea stopped, being a quiet border, and became a mirror, reflecting both its strength and its hidden cracks. For many generations, Atlantis had lived mostly within itself, tending its fields, deepening its canals, building its rings of stone and water, trading cautiously with nearby coasts. But as its knowledge, population, and confidence grew, so did a quiet desire that pulsed beneath daily life, the wish to see what lay beyond the known routes, to be not just an island with visitors, but a name spoken in distant ports. Young sailors looked at maps and felt them as limits rather than guides. Ambitious merchants dreamed of spices and metals they had never seen. Rulers and councillors imagined treaties, protectorates, and networks of loyalty stretching across the sea. Inside many hearts, something stirred between curiosity and ambition, a feeling that Atlantis was meant for more than local comfort, that the island's gifts should be recognised, admired, perhaps even obeyed, far away from its shores. Yet with that stirring came an inner struggle that was not always spoken aloud. Some elders, priests and cautious citizens remembered older teachings about balance and restraint. They wondered whether reaching too far might thin the threads that bound the island together, whether a people spread across too many coasts might forget the simple rituals and shared memories that had once kept them humble. They feared that the more Atlantis measured itself by foreign admiration, tribute, or fear, the less it would remember to measure itself by its own standards of justice and harmony. This conflict between inward steadiness and outward expansion did not shout. It whispered along the edges of council debates and family conversations at night, even as shipyards grew busier and harbours more crowded. Outside, beyond the ring of Atlantean waters, the wider world waited with its own desires, fears, and long histories. Coastal cities, island chains, and inland kingdoms linked to the sea by rivers had their own patterns of trade, their own sacred stories, their own rivalries. Some had heard rumours of Atlantis already, tales of a ringed city with bright harbours, of ships that sailed further and faster, of metalwork and stonework that seemed almost enchanted in their precision. For them, the arrival of Atlantean fleets was both opportunity and threat. A new partner might mean fresh goods, strong allies, and safer routes, but it might also mean pressure to accept foreign rules, foreign judges, foreign gods. As the first significant expedition set sail from Atlantis, well-provisioned ships with sturdy hulls, armed escorts, and carefully chosen envoys, the sea became a long, rolling bridge between different kinds of hope and caution. The early contacts often went well. Atlantean traders brought grain, oil, finished metal tools, and fine cloth. They returned with tall timber, rare dyes, stones with unusual colours, and tales of unfamiliar constellations seen from other coasts. Markets in foreign ports warmed to their presence, and local rulers welcomed their gifts, impressed by their orderly manners and efficient crews. In these first meetings, the Atlanteans acted as students as much as teachers. They learned new navigation tricks, borrowed words for foreign winds, tasted different ways of cooking the catch of the sea, and saw temple designs and local rites that stirred a mixture of curiosity and respect. Their desire in this phase was still close to curiosity, to weave themselves into the world's exchanges, not yet to dominate them. They found helpers in these encounters, local guides, translators, wise merchants who understood how to turn difference into cooperation rather than conflict. Simple handshakes beside wooden docks, shared meals in smoky halls, and joint rituals asking the sea for safe passage formed the quiet foundation of early Atlantean alliances. But as years turned into decades, the shape of these meetings began to change. Success is a kind of tide, and it rose steadily around Atlantis. Profits from distant trade enriched certain families and filled public treasuries. New goods and stories from abroad brought excitement into the capital streets. Young nobles and ambitious officials started to see foreign ports not only as partners, but as pieces on a wider board that Atlantis might one day arrange to its liking. Inside these rising figures, the old inner struggle between modesty and pride sharpened. It became easier to see local customs as provincial and Atlantean ways as superior, easier to think that offering order and guidance to other lands was not only allowable, but generous. Outside, the wider world sensed this shift, like a change in the wind. In some places, Atlantean demands for special harbour rights, exclusive trade agreements, or fixed tribute felt less like friendship and more like soft conquest. Local leaders faced their own inner conflicts, accept these demands in exchange for powerful support, or risk angering a wealthy island whose fleets were growing each year. The sea, still the main stage of this meeting, carried more than goods now. It carried subtle pressures and quiet fears. Conflicts did not explode all at once. They unfolded in small scenes, a dispute over a customs duty in one harbour, a clash between Atlantean guards and local soldiers in another, a treaty that one side felt had been signed under unspoken threat. These tensions created new kinds of encounters beyond the formal halls of rulers. In taverns near the docks, foreign sailors grumbled about Atlantean arrogance, while Atlantean crews complained that they were not properly respected in ports kept safe by their presence. The desire for dignity and the fear of humiliation fueled many of these small, sharp words, yet even as such frictions grew, there were still helpers trying to guide the wider meeting towards something gentler. Thoughtful diplomats on both sides worked to soften harsh phrases and adjust unfair terms. Merchants who had tasted years of good cooperation tried to remind others of the mutual benefits at risk. Priests and philosophers, whether Atlantean or foreign, spoke in their own ways of moderation, of the dangers of pride, and of treating human beings as mere tools in larger schemes. Sometimes they succeeded, drawing back the ships from the brink of war and turning angry stares into cautious negotiations. Sometimes they were simply not heard over the rising clamour of ambition and anxiety. As Atlantis met the wider world more fully, its identity began to stretch. At home, foreign goods, styles, and ideas entered daily life, new music in the markets, new decorations in homes, foreign words slipped into casual speech. For many, this mixing felt rich and exciting, a sign that their island was at the centre of a growing web. Inside others, it stirred a quieter discomfort. Were they still Atlantean or becoming something else? Were the values that had once defined them being deepened by contact or diluted by it? Outside, foreign lands wrestled with their own versions of this question, wondering how much of themselves they could keep while letting Atlantis into their harbours, their councils, their economies. The climax of this long meeting with the world was not a single battle or treaty, but a subtle turning point in perception. Atlantis no longer saw itself as one power among many, but as a natural leader, almost a standard by which others should be measured. The wider world no longer saw Atlantis simply as a prosperous trading partner, but as a presence that might need to be resisted, balanced, or even cut down to size. These quiet changes in how each side read the other altered the meaning of every handshake, every ship arrival, every negotiation. The result was a new, more fragile form of connection, tightly woven by trade and habit, but strained by suspicion and wounded pride. If you imagine now a single Atlantean ship entering a foreign bay at dusk, you can almost feel this tension in the air. The water is calm, the sky soft with fading light. On the deck stand sailors who, years earlier, might have expected only friendly crowds and eager buyers. Now, as they approach the harbour, they see watchtowers where none stood before, more soldiers on the piers, fewer smiles among the waiting faces. On the shore, foreign eyes follow the ship's slow approach with mixed feelings, the hope for needed goods, the fear of growing dependence, the quiet question of how long this balance can last. Between them stretches the narrow strip of water in the harbour, no longer just a path for trade, but a thin shimmering space where trust and doubt meet, moving back and forth like reflections on the surface of the sea. Tonight you are listening to part 16 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift softly through the quiet legacy of Atlantis today, how a lost island, whether real or imagined, still leaves gentle fingerprints on our stories, our questions, and the way we look at the sea, long after the last stone of the ringed city would have vanished beneath the waves. The name Atlantis did not sink with it. It rose again in the minds of philosophers, then in the dreams of poets, explorers, and much later in the calm, late-night thoughts of ordinary people lying awake and listening to the hush of their own world. From the beginning, the desire carried inside this legacy has been simple and powerful. People want Atlantis to mean something. Some wish it to be proof that there was once a civilization wiser or more advanced than our own, a sign that humans have touched greatness before and might do so again. Others want it to stand as a clear warning that no matter how high a culture climbs, it can fall if it forgets balance and humility. In both cases, the longing is the same underneath, a wish for guidance. We hope that this drowned island, whether real or born in thought, can tell us how to live better on the lands we still have. Yet inside modern hearts there is a soft struggle, just as there was inside the Atlanteans themselves. Part of the mind loves the mystery and wants to believe that somewhere under the dark ocean lie streets, walls, and statues from a lost age. Another part insists on proof, on careful evidence, on measurements and maps. People read, watch, and listen to stories of Atlantis with this quiet tension inside them. Is it true? Sits beside what does it teach? And the two questions do not always give the same comfort. Some feel guilty for hoping too much, others feel uneasy for doubting too quickly. The legend's legacy lives right in that space between wanting certainty and accepting that some things may remain forever just out of reach. Outside the mind, the world offers its own resistance. The ocean floor is vast and difficult to search. Science reminds us that continents do not rise and fall in the simple ways old tales describe. Historians point out that written records outside Plato are thin or missing. These are the external forces that push against the story. The slow grind of geology, the strict demands of evidence, the other real disasters, volcanoes, tsunamis, lost coastal cities, that also ask for attention. In a different way, the noise of modern life also works against Atlantis. Busy news cycles, crowded cities, and bright screens can make an old sea legend seem small, like a faint star in a sky full of streetlights. Still, Atlantis has helpers, voices and tools that keep its legacy alive in gentle, shifting ways. Historians and archaeologists, even when they doubt a literal, drowned super empire, keep searching ancient shorelines, studying old flood stories, comparing myths from different cultures. They do not always call what they find Atlantis, but they uncover real places and peoples that might have inspired the tale. Island cities wrecked by waves, coastal cultures wiped out by sudden disasters. Their work helps us see that behind the legend stands a real truth. Civilizations and coastlines are not as permanent as they seem. Storytellers, artists, and filmmakers are helpers too. They take the core shape of Atlantis, a bright ringed city, proud and fragile, and reshape it again and again, so that each generation can meet it in a language it understands. In philosophy and quiet thinking, Atlantis has another life. Plato's old dialogues, where Atlantis appears as an example of a state that loses its virtue, are still read and discussed. Teachers use the island as an image for what happens when wealth and power grow faster than wisdom. The story helps people talk about empires that rise and fall, about how societies change when comfort becomes more important than justice. The climax of that old moral story, the sudden sinking of the island, still hangs over modern readers like a soft bell tone, a reminder that decline can come slowly, then suddenly, when inner balance has been neglected for too long. In this way, Atlantis's legacy is not about stones underwater at all, but about the quiet questions it raises in classrooms, books, and late-night conversations. In stories and novels, Atlantis often appears as a dream of what if. Some imagine it as a city of shining towers, advanced machines, and gentle, wise people who understood healing, energy, or the stars better than we do. Others picture it darker, a place of dangerous experiments and unchecked pride. These different versions all reveal the same thing about our time. We are still unsure whether human progress leads us upward or toward the edge of a cliff. Atlantis becomes a safe stage on which to explore that uncertainty, far enough away that we can watch without feeling directly accused, yet close enough that the echo of the lesson reaches us. In popular culture, the island's name floats almost everywhere. Films show divers finding glowing ruins in deep trenches. Games let players rebuild the lost city or defend it against the coming wave. Cartoons and children's books use Atlantis as a doorway into thinking about oceans, history, and courage. Tourist brochures sometimes hint playfully at Atlantis-like sites, inviting visitors to walk among ruins by the sea. Not all of these uses are serious, and some stretch or ignore history altogether. But even the light-hearted versions keep the outline of the legend alive, like seagrass moving with every current. They ensure that children grow up already knowing the word Atlantis, long before they learn where the story came from. There is also a quieter, more serious legacy that has grown stronger in recent years. As people watch modern coastlines erode, glaciers melt, and sea levels slowly rise, the idea of a great city lost to the ocean no longer feels only like a distant myth. It begins to sound like a possible future. Some writers and thinkers gently connect Atlantis to questions of climate and care for the earth. They do not claim the legend is a literal warning from the past, but they use its shape to ask modern questions. What happens if we build too close to the edge, trusting walls more than wisdom? What if we take the sea for granted until it steps forward and takes back what we assumed was ours forever? In this way, Atlantis becomes part of a larger conversation about how we live on a changing planet. At a more personal level, the legacy is even softer. For some, Atlantis is the first story that made them look at a map and sense the mystery of what lies beyond the line of the shore. For others, it is the first time they understood that even great things can disappear, which adds a bittersweet edge to beauty. Cities, cultures, even moments of life feel more precious when we accept they are not guaranteed to stay. The legend can also offer comfort to those who feel a little out of place in their own time. The idea of a lost world, half remembered, half imagined, can feel like a companion to anyone who senses that there might be more to human history and to human hearts than what is written in simple timelines. If you imagine the quiet legacy of Atlantis today, you will not see one clear monument or single site. Instead, you might picture many small scenes scattered across the world. A child in a coastal town tracing a finger over an atlas, wondering about the empty blue spaces. A student reading Plato by lamplight, turning the pages slowly, thinking not only of an ancient island, but of their own country's choices. A diver surfacing from a shipwreck, looking at the shifting light under the water, and briefly thinking of drowned cities. A person lying awake at night, listening to a recording of ocean waves and a soft voice, telling once again the story of a land that rose, shone, and sank. In all these moments, Atlantis is present, not as a place you can visit, but as a gentle pattern in thought and feeling. It is the feeling that the sea keeps secrets. It is the sense that pride and beauty can exist together, but not without risk. It is the question of how much of our world is as fragile as a city built near the water's edge. And so the island's true legacy may not be on the seafloor at all, but here, inside the quiet places of the modern mind, where every so often, when maps are closed and lights are low, the listener can almost see far beneath the waves of time the faint outline of rings of land and water resting in the dark and still, somehow, gently shining. Tonight you are listening to part 17 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part we will drift slowly through 5 quiet, scholarly debates, the calm, patient arguments that historians, philosophers, and scientists still hold about Atlantis, long after any stones that might have belonged to it have vanished from sight. Here we walk among readers and researchers sitting at wooden desks under lamplight, turning old pages and tracing seacoasts on maps. Their world is quieter than the ringed city ever was, but inside their questions burns a familiar desire to understand what this island really was and what its story truly means. The first debate is the one that everything else leans on. Did Atlantis ever exist as a real place, or was it always a carefully shaped story? In the soft light of libraries, some scholars bend over Plato's dialogues and feel that he is describing a memory, however distorted, perhaps a distant echo of an island or coastal culture destroyed by earthquake or flood. Their desire is to rescue something solid from the mist, to show that behind the legend stands a historical core. Inside, they wrestle with the fear of believing too much, of seeing Atlantis everywhere and losing their footing in speculation. Across the room, others read the same lines and see a moral tale, a crafted fable meant to warn cities against pride. They want the story to be understood as teaching, not as a lost chapter of geography. They struggle quietly with the opposite fear, that by treating Atlantis as pure symbol, they might overlook real traces of past disaster written in the earth. Between these groups, outside pressures are strong, standards of proof, the risk of being dismissed as too romantic on one side or too narrow on the other. Yet both camps share a helper they cannot ignore, the text itself steady and unchanging, inviting careful reading but refusing to answer in a single clear voice. The second debate asks, if Atlantis had a physical counterpart, where might it have been? Scholars spread maps across tables and let their fingers trace shorelines. Some point west toward the wide Atlantic, trusting the literal sound of the name. They imagine a large island beyond familiar coasts, perhaps linked to stories of strange lands glimpsed by ancient sailors or to submerged ridges and plateaus now mapped by modern instruments. Their desire is to take Plato's outer geography seriously, to honour his description of a power beyond the pillars as something more than a flourish. Inside, they know how hard it is to fit such a land into what geology allows. Others turn their gaze closer toward the Mediterranean, the edges of Greece, the Aegean islands, the restless zone where tectonic plates have torn cities apart and buried them under ash. They propose that Atlantis might be a memory of one of these real catastrophes, a local disaster wrapped in grander clothing. Outside them both, the facts of topography, ocean depth, and volcanic history push back, allowing some possibilities and gently closing others. Satellites, sonar maps, and cores of ocean sediment become quiet helpers in this debate, replacing guesswork with contour lines and layers of silt. The third debate flows from the second. When, if ever, would Atlantis have flourished? Plato gives dates that, taken literally, push the story back many thousands of years before his own time, far beyond the span of most known civilizations with stone architecture and complex fleets. Some scholars try to reconcile this by suggesting copying errors in ancient numbers, or by proposing that the tale compresses and stretches time for effect. Their desire is to align the story with periods we can see more clearly: the Bronze Age, the eras of known maritime cultures, the ages of great eruptions. Inside, they wrestle with the unease of adjusting a source to fit external evidence. Others argue that the strange dating is itself a sign that Atlantis was never meant as literal history, but as a kind of once upon a time for philosophers. Outside both positions, the Earth holds its own slow record: layers of ash, drowned shorelines, river mouths now buried under present seas. They show us that coasts have shifted and cities have indeed been lost. The question that remains is whether any of these losses can truly be called Atlantis, or whether the name belongs only to a story. The fourth debate looks inward to the source of the tale itself. Where did Plato get his account? Some researchers follow his claim that the story came from Egypt, from priests who preserved records of an ancient conflict between their land and a powerful island state. They searched temple walls and fragments of papyrus for hints of such an episode, hoping to find even a faint parallel. Their desire is to confirm that behind the dialogue stands an older stream of memory, flowing quietly through other cultures before it reached Greek ears. Inside, they live with the knowledge of how much has been lost to time, war, and decay. Others emphasize Plato's skill as a writer and thinker, and they suggest that he may have woven together bits of geography, older flood stories, and his own political concerns into a narrative that functioned as a mirror for Athens, a crafted example of a state that rises, grows proud, and falls. For them, the true source is philosophical. Atlantis is built out of ideas, as much as out of any remembered place. The helpers in this debate are philologists who study language and structure, and historians of thought who show how the island fits into Plato's wider concerns about justice, order, and the soul of the city. The fifth debate is perhaps the softest and widest. What, in the end, should Atlantis mean to us? Even if we never agree on its exact location, date, or degree of historical reality, scholars still ask how we ought to read it. Some argue that its primary value lies as a political lesson, a case study in how wealth and power can erode virtue. Others see it as part of a broader pattern of flood and disaster myths, a way for ancient peoples to talk about nature's power and the fragility of human work. Still others, more attuned to culture and psychology, notice how Atlantis has been used across centuries as a canvas for hopes of utopia, as a symbol of secret wisdom, as a stage for anxieties about technology and empire. Their desire is to hold these meanings together without letting any single one arouse the others. Inside, they face the gentle frustration of trying to pin down a story that shifts every time a new generation touches it. Outside, the world keeps changing, and with it, the questions people bring to the legend. If you picture these 5 debates not as arguments in a noisy hall, but as circles of light in a darkened library, they look surprisingly peaceful. At one table, someone traces coastlines on a map. At another, someone follows a line of Greek text with a fingertip. At a third, someone compares flood stories from distant cultures. Their tools, books, charts, microscopes for ash and sediment, careful translations, are all quiet helpers in a long, unhurried conversation. No single voice finishes the story. Instead, the questions themselves become a gentle inheritance. Atlantis, in this scholarly light, is no longer just a sunken city or a warning. It is a set of open doors. And as night deepens outside the windows, and the sea lies somewhere beyond the reach of lamplight, those doors remain slightly ajar, inviting anyone who cares to sit down, turn a page, and listen for themselves to the faint, persistent sound of an island that might have been, and the many meanings it still carries across the waters of the mind. Tonight, you are listening to part 18 of our Atlantis journey, and in this part, we will move slowly through the biggest misunderstandings about Atlantis, the soft, persistent illusions that gather like mist around the legend, blurring its shape until it is hard to see what is story, what is wish, and what might be a small fragment of truth. In the quiet of modern nights, when someone hears the word Atlantis, their mind often jumps at once to glowing cities under glass domes, impossible machines, or a single perfect civilization that taught the rest of the world everything it knows. These images are beautiful, but they are also misunderstandings, born from a deep desire in the human heart, the longing for a lost answer that explains everything. People want Atlantis to be the key that unlocks all mysteries at once, the origin of every pyramid, every strange ruin, every shared symbol. Inside that desire there is something innocent, a wish for simplicity, for one grand explanation. But there is also a quiet danger, because when one story is made to carry the weight of all others, the real variety and richness of many different cultures begins to fade in the background like light swallowed by fog. One common misunderstanding imagines Atlantis as a place of near-magical technology, so advanced that it could not possibly have grown from the same slow learning that shaped other societies. In this version, Atlanteans float in crystal towers, harness clean, limitless energy, or command machines that move mountains with a touch. The inner appeal of this picture is clear. If such a people once existed, then perhaps human beings are capable of much more than the world today allows. It is a comforting dream, especially in times when progress feels stuck or troubled. But outside that dream, the quiet facts of history and archaeology remain steady. Every known civilization, no matter how brilliant, shows signs of gradual development, tools improving step by step, buildings evolving over generations, knowledge spreading from one group to another. To imagine Atlantis as a sudden leap beyond all this can make real human achievements elsewhere feel small, as if ordinary hands could never have carved temples or charted stars without secret help. This leads to a second, softer, but more serious misunderstanding, the idea that Atlantis must have been the single source of all advanced knowledge, and that other ancient peoples could not have built pyramids, aligned monuments with the sky, or navigated seas without lessons from this one lost island. The desire underneath this belief is often not cruel. It is a sort of wonder at how similar structures and symbols appear in far separated places. Yet inside this wonder can hide an unspoken doubt about the abilities of those other cultures, as if Egyptians, Mesopotamians, early Chinese, or ancient American peoples could not possibly have created complex societies by themselves. It becomes more tempting to point to a vanished teacher civilization than to recognize that many groups of humans in many different places are capable of patience, observation, and genius. Outside, the record of archaeology quietly shows variety. Different styles of building, different methods of observing the heavens, different spiritual symbols, each with its own roots. When Atlantis is raised up as the secret author of everything, these differences are flattened, and the dignity of many peoples is reduced, often without the storyteller realizing it. A third misunderstanding paints Atlantis as a kind of pure, superior race or culture from which lesser peoples sprang, twisting the legend into something cold and divisive. This use of Atlantis does not come from the old philosophers' pages. It comes from later centuries, when some writers tried to dress their own prejudices in the clothing of myth. Their desire was not for quiet understanding, but for a story that made their own group seem chosen and others naturally inferior. Inside such tales, the lost island becomes a shining ancestral homeland, and modern people are ranked by how close they are imagined to be to its imagined bloodlines. Outside, this kind of thinking has been used to justify harm, conquest, and contempt. The helpers against this misuse are calm voices in history, anthropology, and simple human empathy. They remind us that no myth, however beautiful, should be twisted to make some humans less human. The true lesson of Atlantis, if there is one, is about the fragility of greatness, not about a ladder of worth among peoples, A fourth misunderstanding assumes that every unexplained ruin, every strange stone, every deep sea formation must be linked to Atlantis. When someone finds a curious shape on the ocean floor, or a particularly mysterious structure on land, the word Atlantis rises quickly, like a reflex. The desire behind this habit is the love of excitement. It feels more thrilling to say, this is Atlantean, than we do not know yet, or it belongs to a lesser known culture with no famous name. Inside, many people fear the feeling of not knowing. They would rather anchor the unknown to a story they already recognize. Outside, however, this rush can drown out patient research. Real, smaller histories of fishermen, traders, local kingdoms, or forgotten villages are sometimes pushed aside for the louder legend. The quiet helpers here are careful methods, dating techniques, comparisons of building style, studies of local stories. They do not always provide quick answers, but they protect the truth that the world contains many stories, not just one dramatic one. A fifth misunderstanding goes in the opposite direction. The belief that because some modern tales are wild or irresponsible, the entire subject of Atlantis must be foolish and worthless, never to be mentioned except as a joke. The desire behind this reaction is to stay safe from error, to mark clear lines between serious and unserious topics. Inside, some scholars and thinkers worry that showing any interest in Atlantis will cause their other work to be doubted. But throwing away the legend entirely also discards its more thoughtful uses. Even if Atlantis were entirely fictional, Plato's story still speaks about power, pride, and the moral health of societies. The long echo of the myth still reveals how humans think about loss, oceans, and the rise and fall of cultures. Outside, the world we live in is full of real coastal ruins, true flood stories, and genuine questions about how stable our own cities are. The legend of Atlantis provides a gentle way to think about these things, even if no exact island can be found. When we look at all these misunderstandings together, Atlantis as magical super technology, as single parent of all civilization, as banner for imagined superiority, as explanation for every mystery, or as something so silly it must never be considered, we see the same pattern repeating. In each case, the legend is being stretched to meet desires that are really about us. Our hunger for wonder, our discomfort with uncertainty, our need to feel special, our fear of looking naive. The helpers who quietly correct these distortions are not loud debunkers alone, but thoughtful guides, historians who separate later editions from older texts, archaeologists who remind us of the variety of human cultures, geologists who explain what the earth can and cannot do, philosophers who return to the original story and ask what questions it was meant to explore. They do not try to kill the myth, they try to let it stand in its proper size. If we move softly past the misunderstandings, what remains is still something gentle and valuable. Atlantis, seen without exaggeration, is a story about a gifted society that forgets its balance, about an island blessed by nature and skill that becomes vulnerable when its inner compass shifts. It is also a mirror for how we handle mystery itself, whether we rush to fill every gap with dazzling answers, or whether we allow some spaces to stay open, lit only by careful questions and quiet curiosity. As night gathers around this part of the tale, you might imagine the legend itself as a shape on the seafloor, almost obscured by drifting silt and the shadows of passing fish. Around it swim all the misunderstandings, bright, noisy creatures that brush against it and move on. Beneath them, the core of the story lies still. Not a perfect blueprint, not proof of secret masters, but a soft outline of rise and fall, pride and loss, shining faintly in the dark water, waiting for each listener to approach it slowly, with both wonder and care. Tonight, you are listening to part 19 of our Atlantis journey. And in this part, we will drift softly through Atlantis in film, literature, and popular culture, the many ways this lost island has been dressed, repainted, and reimagined for new eyes and new nights. If the ancient story is like a faint shape on the seafloor, then books, movies, comics, and games are the coloured lights that sweep across it, each one revealing a different angle for a little while before moving on. Through them, Atlantis has become not just a legend of the past, but a companion to the dreams and anxieties of the modern world. In the quiet world of books, Atlantis first reappeared not as a loud spectacle, but as a theme drifting through adventure tales and speculative stories. Writers looked back to Plato's brief account and felt inside themselves a familiar desire to fill in the gaps. What did the streets look like? How did people live? How exactly did the island fall? Early novelists and later science fiction authors answered by building whole imagined cities beneath the waves. Some described domes of glass and metal lit by strange underwater lamps. Others pictured vast caverns under the ocean floor, where Atlantean survivors continued their lives in secret. The inner conflict in these stories often lay between wonder and warning. Did Atlantis fall because of external disaster alone, or because of something inside its people? Pride, ambition, or forbidden experiments? Readers followed characters who discovered lost libraries, strange machines, or ancient temples, and felt the same mixed emotions: excitement at uncovering a hidden world, and a soft unease that such power had once slipped from human hands. Children's books and illustrated tales took a gentler path, turning Atlantis into a place of bright colours and simple lessons. In some stories, young heroes or curious animals stumble upon the sunken city and find friendly Atlanteans waiting, eager to share secrets of peace, cooperation, or care for the oceans. The desire behind these versions is kind and clear: to use the legend as a bridge to teach children about empathy, environmental respect, or the value of knowledge. Inside, writers of these tales struggle quietly to balance magic and fear. They want the idea of a lost city under the sea to feel mysterious, not terrifying. So the ruins become playgrounds, the deep ocean becomes a home, and the fall of Atlantis is framed not as a final doom, but as a lesson that helped its people become wiser in their hidden world. When we move into the soft glow of cinema, Atlantis changes shape yet again. On the large screen, it often appears as a fully realised city of impossible architecture. Tall towers rising from the seabed, coral-like palaces, glowing streets where fish and people move together through the water. Filmmakers use light, colour, and sound to turn the old legend into a place viewers can almost walk through with their eyes. The desire here is strong, to let audiences feel that they have truly visited Atlantis for a few hours. Inside the studios where these films are planned, artists and writers debate what this city should say about us. Should it be utopian, a place of advanced wisdom, kindness, and harmony with nature? Or should it be darker, full of secrets, internal divisions, and old mistakes that mirror our own world? In some films, Atlantis is portrayed as a noble, hidden kingdom that once tried to protect the world from its own aggression, retreating beneath the waves only when misunderstood. In others, it is reimagined as a fallen empire whose survivors still guard dangerous artifacts or forbidden powers. The antagonists in these stories may be greedy, modern treasure hunters, rival underwater factions, or even Atlanteans themselves, torn between isolation and involvement with the surface world. Yet, even in the most dramatic plots, the sea often remains a quiet, steady presence, a reminder that all human plans, ancient or modern, are carried out within a larger, older element that does not answer to us. Comic books and graphic novels have given Atlantis yet another face. In some long running series, Atlantis becomes a full kingdom in a shared fictional universe, ruled by a hero who must constantly balance loyalty to his underwater people with responsibility to the surface world. The desire driving these stories is to explore identity and belonging in a vivid visual form. The Atlantean ruler is often drawn between two worlds, never entirely at ease in either. Inside, such characters wrestle with questions that feel very human. Where do I truly belong? Who counts as my people? How do I protect both my home and others who are different from me? Outside, waves of conflict and alliance roll back and forth between Atlantis and surface nations, turning the old myth into a stage for thinking about diplomacy, fear, and cooperation. In games, board games, video games, role-playing worlds, Atlantis becomes a place the player can touch through choices. Sometimes it is a city that must be evacuated before it sinks, testing how quickly and wisely people can act when time is short. Sometimes it is a ruin to be explored room by room, with puzzles to solve and artifacts to find. Sometimes it is a thriving underwater civilization that the player must guide, balancing resources, technology, and environmental limits. The desire behind these game worlds is to let people feel the Atlantis story with their own decisions, to feel the tension of a collapsing island, the curiosity of discovering lost corridors, or the weight of ruling a fragile, powerful city. Inside, players experience their own small struggles, whether to exploit resources quickly or conserve them, whether to chase glory or protect their people. These digital or tabletop Atlantean echoes turn the legend into a quiet practice ground for ethical choices. Even when everything is wrapped in fantasy colours, popular culture as a whole has woven Atlantis into its fabric in more subtle ways too. The very word Atlantis is used in song lyrics, brand names, resort designs, and theme park attractions. It has become shorthand for lost paradise, mysterious depth, or hidden greatness. A hotel with fountains and carvings calls itself by that name to suggest luxury and wonder. A song about emotional distance might mention Atlantis as an unreachable place under the waves. The desire behind these casual uses is simple. The word itself carries a soft glow. It suggests something beautiful and gone, something worth longing for, even if the details remain vague. Yet this constant reuse also spreads the legend very widely, so that even those who have never read Plato or watched a film about the Lost Island still know, at least dimly, that Atlantis is the sunken city somewhere in the shared imagination. There is, however, a quiet tension inside this modern reimagining. The more Atlantis is turned into a backdrop for adventure, romance, or spectacle, the easier it is to forget the older, sharper edges of its meaning. A city lit in blue and gold under the sea can become pure fantasy, floating free from the questions Plato once attached to it, about justice, pride, and the fate of societies that forget their moral centre. Outside the screen and page, some thoughtful creators try to bring those questions back. They design stories where the beauty of Atlantis is matched by its responsibility, where the fall of the island is not just a storm scene, but a consequence of choices. In doing so, they act as quiet helpers, keeping the legend from drifting too far away from its roots. If you step back and look gently at all these versions, books, children's tales, films, comics, games, songs, you might see them as many coloured threads winding around the same invisible shape. Each medium takes what it needs: adventure, warning, wonder, sorrow. Each adds a new detail. Shimmering towers here, crystal engines there, royal courts, hidden archives, deep trenches lit by strange lights. Inside the hearts of those who make these stories, the same mixed feelings swirl. Admiration for human creativity, unease about human excess, curiosity about what lies beyond what we can see. Outside, audiences receive the legend in pieces. A bedtime story here, a movie there, a passing reference in a song on a long drive at night. And so Atlantis in popular culture becomes less a single picture and more a shifting reflection on the surface of water. Different lights, different times of day, different moods change how it looks, but something constant remains beneath. The sense of a place that rose, shone, and was lost, a place that still asks us very quietly what we would build, how we would govern, and what we might risk losing if we ever believed ourselves untouchable. As you imagine this now, you might picture a dark cinema after the credits have rolled, or a quiet room after a book has been closed. The screen is black, the pages are still, but in the mind of the watcher or reader, a faint image remains, rings of land and water under a deep blue sea, waiting not to be found with a ship or a machine, but to be visited again the next time a story whispers its name. Tonight, you are listening to part 20 of our Atlantis journey, and in this final part, we will move softly through the gentle lessons that Atlantis leaves for today, a set of quiet understandings, not shouted warnings that drift toward us like slow waves in the dark. We have walked with this island from its misty beginnings to its shining height, from its inner struggles to its long echo in memory. Now, as we come to rest at the far edge of the story, we are not asked to solve a puzzle or choose a side. We are simply invited to sit with what this legend stirs inside us and to see what small, human-sized truths it offers to anyone living far from its vanished shores. One of the first lessons Atlantis whispers is about balance. The island began in simplicity, people wondering if they could trust a new land, learning how to tend soil and read the sea. Their desire then was modest: safety, food, shelter, a place to belong. As centuries passed, that desire widened: order, beauty, influence, perfection. None of these wishes were wrong in themselves, but the story shows how easily they can slide out of balance. Atlantis did not fall because it dreamed. It fell when the dream grew louder than its memory of limits. For us, the question is quiet but clear. In our own lives, our work, our families, our cities, how often do we let expansion, improvement, and growth drown out the small voice that asks whether we are stretching the land, our time, or our hearts too far? Balance is not a fixed point. It is a movement, like standing on a boat. Atlantis reminds us that the act of rebalancing is constant, and that forgetting to do it is where trouble begins. Another lesson lies in how the island treated its gifts. Atlantis was rich in land, metals, harbours, and mild weather. At first, these were received with gratitude, turned into carefully planned fields, sturdy homes, and ships that served both trade and exploration. Over time, though, the relationship shifted. Gifts became expectations. Expectations became entitlements. Inside the story, this change is subtle but important. When a society begins to see its advantages as something it simply deserves, rather than something it must care for, the ground under it grows quietly thinner. Today, many of us live in places where food appears easily, water flows at a tap, light fills rooms at the push of a switch. Atlantis asks us gently, do we still see these as gifts? Do we understand the networks of people, land, and effort that make them possible? Or have we begun to treat them as unshakable facts, forgetting how fragile they really are? The legend does not scold, it only holds up a mirror, reminding us that gratitude is not a decoration, but a form of wisdom. There is also a lesson about how we use power, whether personal or collective. Atlantis grew strong. Its fleets ranged far. Its laws and architecture impressed visitors. Its knowledge of engineering and planning outpaced many neighbours. Power in itself is not the villain of the story. For a long time, Atlantean strength protected trade routes, deterred raiders, and allowed art and learning to bloom. The trouble came when power stopped being a tool and became a measure of worth. Inside the island, some began to believe they were better simply because they were stronger. Outside, others felt that strength is pressure rather than protection. For us, this pattern can appear in many scales. A company that forgets its duty to its workers in the rush to grow, a nation that measures itself only by its armies or its wealth, even a single person who begins to treat influence as a reason to expect more than others. Atlantis suggests that the question is not do we have power, but what shape does our power take in the lives of those around us? Is it a shelter or a weight, a tool for shared safety or a ladder for a few? These are soft questions, but they linger. The myth also speaks about listening, to land, to limits, and to older wisdom. For many generations, Atlanteans paid close attention to their environment. They read the sky and soil, adjusted canals, respected floodplains, and kept stories of past storms and quakes alive so younger people would remember. Later, as pride and hurry grew, some of that listening thinned. Warnings from cautious voices were brushed aside. Small signs from the earth were noticed and then explained away. When we look at our own time, the coasts we build on, the forests we cut, the air and water we change, the story gently asks, are we still listening or only speaking? Do we regard scientists, elders, careful observers of nature as helpers or as obstacles to speed and comfort? Atlantis does not say that disaster is inevitable. It simply shows what can happen when the conversation between humanity and its home becomes one-sided. There is a quieter, more personal lesson too, in the way Atlantis has been remembered. The island, if it ever existed, is gone. What remains is a story that has been retold, reshaped, and argued over for centuries. Some see that as frustrating, a lack of firm answers. But another way to read it is as a reminder that not everything valuable can be nailed down. Some things teach us precisely because they stay a little out of reach. In our own lives, we often want clear conclusions, definite verdicts on who we were, what our choices meant, whether we succeeded or failed. Atlantis invites a softer view. A life like a legend may never be reduced to one final sentence. What matters might not be the certainty of our stories, but the quality of the questions they keep alive in us. Am I living with balance? Am I using what I have kindly? Am I listening when something inside or outside me whispers, enough? The myth carries one more gentle lesson about loss itself. Atlantis is, at its heart, a story about something beautiful that is no longer here. It tells us that even the brightest cities, the most careful systems, and the most confident cultures can pass away. At first, that thought may feel heavy, but under it lies a kind of strange comfort. If even Atlantis could vanish, then change and loss are not personal punishments. They are part of the fabric of this world. Knowing that can make us hold what we love with a different touch, not in a tight, fearful grip, but with a mix of care and acceptance. We tend our homes, our relationships, our projects as best we can, Yet we also understand that nothing is guaranteed forever. This does not make effort pointless. It makes each moment of harmony more precious. And then there is the softest lesson of all, that stories themselves can be a form of shelter. For thousands of nights, in different languages and places, people have spoken of Atlantis to one another by lamplight, by firelight, under modern bulbs, and now through headphones in darkened rooms. The island has become a meeting place for listeners who will never meet in person, a shared shoreline in the mind. When you listen to this tale, you join a long, quiet line of others who have done the same: sailors, scholars, dreamers, children, night shift workers, people who could not sleep and went looking for a voice to keep them company. Atlantis may or may not have existed in stone, but as a story, it clearly exists in us, and that shared space can make the world feel a little less lonely. As we come to the end of this journey, there is room for gratitude, both within the story and outside it. Within, we can feel thankful for the unnamed farmers, sailors, builders, and caretakers whose patient skills allowed Atlantis to flourish as long as it did. Their quiet wisdom, even if it was not enough to prevent the final fall, remains part of the legend's gentler side. Outside, here and now, there is a different kind of thanks for your time, your attention, the nights or hours you have given to walking this long circle around a vanished island. In a world that pulls in many directions, you chose for a while to sit with one story and let it move slowly through you. That choice has its own quiet beauty. If you like, you can picture Atlantis one last time, not at the moment of its sinking, not at the height of its pride, but at a peaceful dusk somewhere in the middle of its life. The sun is low, the rings of water reflect a sky just turning gold. Smoke rises in thin lines from cooking fires. Children run along a canal's edge. A sailor checks the moorings of a ship. A priest closes a temple door with a soft, practiced gesture. Mountains watch from a distance, steady and unreadable. For a brief, calm moment, nothing is rising or falling. Everything simply is. Then the light fades, lamps are lit, and the city drifts into night, unaware of how long its story will echo. And you, listening now, lie in your own time and place, far from that imagined shore, yet touched by it for a while. When you close your eyes, the sea may sound a little deeper, history a little nearer, your own days a little more precious. The tale of Atlantis recedes like a tide, leaving behind only a few glimmering shells of thought on the sand. Balance, gratitude, listening, care. You can pick them up or leave them there. Either way, the ocean of stories will go on breathing around you, and somewhere beneath its surface, in the quiet dark, the rings of a lost island will continue to rest, patient and still, as another night settles over the waters of the world.